Need you to, that chair's a little heavy. You can move it up. Well, there you go.
Yes, sir.
All right, you may proceed.
Good morning. Would you state and spell your name for the court reporter?
Yes, Dr. Daniel Buffington, Buffington.
And what is your occupation?
I am a clinical pharmacologist and toxicologist at the University of South Florida in Tampa, and also manage a specialty practice called Clinical Pharmacology Services.
Are you a licensed pharmacist in the state of Florida?
Yes, Florida and Georgia,
And how long have you been a licensed pharmacist in the state of Florida?
since 1987.
And can you tell the jury what you do as a doctor of pharmacy and a toxicologist?
Yes, so the Doctor of Pharmacy degree is the highest level training in pharmacology and toxicology in clinical practice settings. So working with patients who are on high-risk medications, have patients having drug metabolism issues, a wide variety. I describe what we do as air traffic control for a patient's medication profile. So the patients who are referred to our specialty practice typically are on 10, 15, 20 plus medications, seeing multiple practitioners, may have psychiatric issues, variety of other orthopedic, pain management, substance use disorder issues, where identifying or monitoring what an individual's on is imperative to make sure they have the right therapeutic goal, but also to avoid side effects and toxicities.
And do you also, in addition to that private practice, do you work in the field of forensic pharmacology?
I do. So in addition to patient care and doing clinical research trials, I serve as an expert for the Federal Department of Health and Human Services for Medicare specifically. Worked with them full-time for about 5 years, and also with law enforcement, with therapy, but we also get questions that impact the court where it's about for what I do. We're actually helping to develop that right now, and I've helped to write other types of board certifications as well.
Have you also attended a continuing education in your field?
Attended, required each year, but also I'm one of the presenters for those continuing education. So I teach students and practitioners at the University of South Florida. I'm affiliated with about 20-some different universities around the country where they send students to our practice for clinical rotations. And then I also routinely present at state and national meetings.
Are you a member of any professional organizations in your field?
Yes, that would take a while.
So it would be fair to say several.
Several, from the AMA, the American Medical Association, the American Pharmacist Association, the American College of Clinical Pharmacology, the American Society of Consultant Pharmacists, their state affiliate organizations as well.
And have you published articles in your field?
Yes, ma'am.
And are those peer-reviewed or reviewed by the people who also work in your field?
Yes, ma'am.
And how many of those have you published?
I think over 30.
Do you also serve as a research consultant for the pharmaceutical industry?
I do. So when new medications are developed, it's common that they are initial research, what we call phase 1, is done in a specific lab. But by the time it gets to phase 2 and phase 3, that's where it's out being developed in the field across the country in different research practice sites. And I do phase 2 and phase 3 research as well. So it could be a project on something we're developing where USF has the intellectual property for the substance. could also be one of many sites for a particular pharmaceutical company prior to FDA review and approval, where it takes a large volume of patient experience before a product gets approved.
And you mentioned you work also in the field of forensic pharmacology. Have you testified in courts here in Florida as an expert in that field?
Yes, ma'am. Florida and other states, and probably at this point since the early 90s, in excess of 300 sometimes.
And have you testified in both civil and criminal cases?
Civil, criminal, family, state, federal, military.
And have you been retained in this judicial circuit by both the state and the prosecution?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you testify for the state and the prosecution, the state and the defense at the same financial remuneration?
Yes, and that's also the same rate that equates to what our fees are for seeing a patient in our clinic. So it's the same fee, flat.
Were you retained to offer your services in the McDowell case?
Yes, in, I think it was mid-22.
What records and materials were provided to you in advance of your work on this case?
Yes, ma'am. There were law enforcement records. There were depositions. Other court records were provided as well.
And did you meet with Patrick McDowell?
I did in October of 23 here in Jacksonville
And where was that meeting?
at the Good Retention Center or Correction Center.
And that's the Duval County Jail.
Yes, ma'am.
How long did you spend with Mr. McDowell?
If I recall, it was about 2 hours.
And did you learn that Mr. McDowell had previously been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes.
And did you learn about his substance abuse history?
Yes, ma'am.
And did you learn about his medications history?
Yes.
And have you prepared a PowerPoint to assist us in your testimony?
I did. Some illustrations that I think would be helpful for the court.
Right, if we could pull up the first page of that PowerPoint, that's the page, right? Could you tell the jurors a little bit about what they're looking at there?
So when I'm going to do an evaluation, whether it's inpatient or in a forensic setting, it's looking at first the person as a whole. What is the impact with regards to their pharmacology history, their past medical history, family and social history issues that may have impacted? Where that can come in is looking at, is there a history of mental health disorders in the family that may be indicative of how difficult their presentation may be when they're diagnosed and ultimately being treated. We look for introduction, and if there's early onset, an introduction to alcohol and substances in that individual, what their pattern of response was to those. But then even as you go forward into teens and 20s and adulthood, we're also looking at, were there times when either mental health, substance use disorder, or medications, could be even prescription medications, were impactful in understanding how they individually respond to medications. And from an illicit medication or substance perspective is how severe was their challenge or their issues throughout their life. So that's depicted here across from birth to adulthood.
And so that's an assessment of, basically a summary of your investigative interview of Mr. McDowell.
That's correct.
All right. And did you learn that he had any kind of alcohol history as a youth?
He did. He had an early introduction. I think his earliest was about 12 or 13. By the age of 16, he was using alcohol substantially heavier, more than an average teen would be accessing and using. Also, introduction to marijuana and other substances. So at an early age, that's significantly a correlate with future substance use disorder problems.
And did you learn what Patrick McDowell's previous prescription medication history was?
I did.
And do you have a slide that shows that?
I do. I think it's
Take a look at the next
might be
slide.
the next one. No.
One more over.
And I think one more after that.
One more after that. Yeah.
There you go.
If you could go through that with the jury and tell the jury what those medications are for.
Yes, ma'am. So when I look at a patient's medication list, it's depictive for me of understanding how and what those medications do, what they've been treated for, and oftentimes descriptive of the challenges of controlling a particular condition. So if you look here from early as 2010, he's being treated not with one, but two medications for managing depression and anxiety-related issues. And those are trazodone by the brand name Deseril or sertraline by the brand name Zoloft. So frequently, an individual, and at a younger age, may be able to be controlled with one substance. As you start to see combination therapies, it's usually indicative of a greater clinical challenge trying to control. Within 2 years, in 2012, those have been switched to other medications, to amitriptyline, brand name Elavil, and prazosin, brand name Minipress. So it's indicating that there are challenges within the practitioner's level of finding the right medications that are going to help to manage his conditions. By 2014, he's on opiate for pain in his left leg. In an individual who's already had substance use disorder challenges, has used alcohol and other substances, it's very tricky to add in pain medications, specifically opiates, because of the risk for them to attract to that sensation or feeling that the pain medications produce. I didn't see that that went on long in 2014, but as you review his history later, his opiate use did increase later as well, and in abuse of that. By 2018, he's back to Elavil, and by 2019, he had had a seizure disorder, and Keppra is beneficial for both seizures and depression. So it seems like it would be a logical choice if he had developed seizures of the medication to use in his case. Much more potent, by the way.
Did you learn that in the months prior to the shooting of Deputy Moyers, Mr. McDowell had become dependent upon the drug methamphetamine?
Yes.
And there's a slide, I think, if we go two back, perhaps.
The other direction.
Can you tell the jury what methamphetamine is?
Yes, so methamphetamine is actually a prescription medication. That might surprise some people. It's by the brand name Disoxin. It was developed many years ago. It's in the same family or class as amphetamine. So amphetamine is a distinct chemical structure, but it's also referred to as the class name. So amphetamines is amphetamine-like substances. They're central nervous system stimulants. So where an opiate is a central nervous system depressant, a benzodiazepine is a depressant, these are substances that are helpful for ADHD and other types of and narcolepsy and sleep disorder that are beneficial for stimulating the brain. And they work specifically by impacting or regulating, artificially regulating, the chemicals in the brain that are necessary for normal brain function.
And is there also an illicit use of methamphetamine, non-prescription use?
Very much. And because it's inexpensive and easy to manufacture outside, also in higher doses than we would use clinically, it can produce an intense euphoria and rush. I liken it to, if you remember, I said it's a central nervous system stimulant. Imagine walking into a dark room and turning a lamp on. And that's like an enlightening moment, no pun intended. The description for methamphetamine at higher doses is it's like turning the lights on, but it's the equivalent of enough lights for the runway at the airport, combined with an intense rush, a feeling of increased self-esteem and presence. So it's that high that's related to methamphetamine is extremely attractive to an individual for a sense of increased control and productivity and the euphoria that associates with it. That's fleeting, but it does happen.
And is there a slide that we have that shows exactly what methamphetamine is and what it does when it hits the brain?
So if you go back, I think 3, another, one more. Maybe one more.
It's the technology we're trying.
There we go.
All right. Can you explain exactly what methamphetamine does to the human brain?
Yes. So I stated that it was a central nervous system stimulant. There are chemicals in the brain that we refer to that we all make, that we all depend on, and we depend on them to be at normal levels and normal sensitivity, and they're referred to as neurotransmitters. If you think of the brain in the sense of a matrix or a connection or a linkage of neurons, between each neuron is called the synapse, that gap, and that's where chemicals, these neurotransmitters, are functioning to help to affect judgment, mood, proper cognitive status, awareness. And in that, if those are firing and properly sensitive, you're in a good state. When someone comes in and they're depressed, or they have paranoia, or they have anxiety, we're using certain psychiatric medications to try to help regulate those. In the case of methamphetamine, one of its dangerous sides is it's not only affecting one of those neurotransmitters, so some by name you would maybe heard of are serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. They each have their own role and they each produce a function. The problem with methamphetamine is it affects 4 of them substantially. It affects dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and another one called glutamate. And what methamphetamine does, and certainly at higher doses, it comes in and, as I stated before, that intense rush. What it's doing is it's dumping those chemicals into that synapse space, and they're not being processed or retaken. So it's in essence like if you ran your car and went home and left it running and never turned it off, it's wearing on the parts. And that's what's happening in the brain is when you have that intense rush, it's not just a feeling. If you keep putting methamphetamine in the system, it's actually causing what we refer to as neurotoxicity. It's damaging the cells in the brain. So an individual will often chase the intense rush. So it's unlike most other medications. The substance effect can be outwards of about 10 to 15 hours, but the substance stays in your system for upwards of 3 days. So you're putting this in, you're dumping those neurotransmitters and chemicals, disrupting, and over-processing and actually causing damage to the neurons itself.
Is methamphetamine an addictive drug?
One of the highest addictive substances that we know of.
And what makes it so addictive?
It's that intense rush and that sense of trying to persist that feeling and that sensation. Many individuals, if they can find access through whatever means to get access, whether it's financially access, stealing it, making it, unfortunately people can make it, they'll use it persistently for days on end. And we refer to that as a binge. The problem is as you deplete those neurotransmitters, days in you start to hit another phase called tweaking. And tweaking is very dangerous. Tweaking is where you have, now you're starting to see psychiatric changes, you're starting to see the damage and the inflammation caused by the persistent presence of high-dose methamphetamine. So it's not uncommon that people will keep trying to redose to keep that feeling going. But when they start to hit tweaking, probably maybe not the best of analogy would be like a withdrawal feeling, where it's now not simply that they want to keep the feeling, that they're starting to experience psychiatric symptoms and physical symptoms related to the high dose exposure for days on end.
And based on Mr. McDowell's history, did you consider him a high volume user of methamphetamine at the time leading up to this shooting?
Yes.
And you also mentioned that intensive use of methamphetamine can actually damage the brain cells.
It does.
And is that more likely to occur in a young adult rather than a middle-aged or older person?
Well, the damage can happen to both equally. The problem in a younger individual is we don't think that the neurologic development comes to an end point until somewhere in the mid to late 20s. So if an individual is using in their teens and 20s, they're compounding the damage in that they're possibly not even fully finishing their neurologic development.
And you said that methamphetamine was one of the most addictive substances. Could you compare it to other controlled substances like marijuana or cocaine? Is that possible?
Well, so it's a good point. I would not compare it to marijuana for about 100 reasons. Marijuana's a central nervous system depressant. Totally different feeling, different drive, different pharmacology, what's happening. However, cocaine, the answer is yes. And one of the The other most addictive substance is crack cocaine. And I use that specifically, is crack cocaine, more so than if it's injected or others, is associated with also a fast administration, an intense rush, and individuals typically trying to replenish that sensation or feeling. So they're both central nervous system stimulants, and they're both associated. Individuals can take meth a variety of ways. Smoking it brings it in, the vapors into the lungs, and the lungs are a great delivery or administration absorption vehicle. But if you bring it in through the nostrils, so if you think of snorting cocaine and other substances, you're getting the upper respiratory, the sinus mucosa, but you're also getting the lungs as well. So individuals will do that with methamphetamine as well, and they refer to that as hot rails.
And so hot rails is actually just smoking the methamphetamine directly into the nostrils.
I would call that inhaling.
Inhaling.
Yes, ma'am. But it is heating to the point of also producing vapors and then inhaling through the nostrils so that you're getting both upper and lower respiratory absorption.
And are there long-term effects of methamphetamine, high-volume methamphetamine use or addiction?
Yes. So the drug takes, as I stated, about 3 weeks to clear from the body. So I consider that long-term in terms of when a person thinks they last used, it can take several weeks before they've reproduced the neurotransmitters that they depleted. There's also other physiologic effects. You can have damage to nerves in the brain and periphery, where individuals may have something called skin picking. They may, in fact, be at risk for increased infections, but they also get damage to the sensation to the nerves and will imagine that they have something in or crawling on their skin to the degree that they're obsessed with that and end up creating deep fissures in their skin and infection and scarring. That's characteristic of chronic meth. And then on a longer basis, if in fact they've used substantially, they can have neurotoxicity where they have long-term decline in their cognitive function, their emotional stability, and psychiatric status. And it's even worse if somebody is abusing a substance that affects psychiatric status, if an individual already has an underlying psychiatric condition. So one of the problems is people will try to self-medicate with substances. If they actually have a baseline condition, it may substantially mismanage that underlying condition.
And you earlier said that methamphetamine can destroy or degrade the brain cell functioning. What are the long-term effects of that?
Any of the traditional psychiatric diagnoses. So it could be paranoia, depression, hallucinations, anxiety, mood instability, judgment, cognitive status.
And when a person becomes addicted to methamphetamine, what does their goal-directed behavior turn to?
Simply to sustain that sensation and euphoria.
And is that referred to as chasing the high?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, is it possible that a person who abstained from methamphetamine use, perhaps because of treatment or incarceration, for a year, could become an addict again?
It's one of the highest risk factors in a sense that, just like you think of with alcohol, once you've had a sensation, when you're fighting and trying to rehab and avoid the use or misuse of that substance, relapses are common. So it's that letting that back in as a personal crutch or vice is extremely dangerous and typically associated with severe relapse on subsequent times.
Do you work with rehabilitation facilities?
I do, with patients who are in substance use disorder rehab, but also as a consultant to facilities.
And is it uncommon for people to relapse when they're in rehabilitative programs for methamphetamine addiction?
No, it's very common.
And can that happen a second or a third time?
And many more.
And that's something you've seen in your involvement with patients and in rehab?
Yes, it is a difficult addiction to overcome.
Is it easier to become addicted the second or a subsequent time?
I think it's just an indication of the severity of the addiction. So it's difficult to put up barriers, whether it's subsequent laboratory testing for screening. We even have certain medications for some things, like with alcohol. For an alcoholic, we can give a medication to them that if they drink, it causes substantial nausea and vomiting, very uncomfortable symptoms. We don't have that for methamphetamine.
Why can't a person who is using methamphetamine at a high volume level just decide not to use it and quit?
Because the brain cells are seeking that intense sensation again. Again, we're not just saying the feeling of having a drink and saying you feel relaxed. This is an intense brain rush that happens and sustains itself for hours. And then, again, the brain is asking for more. The other issue is, as I mentioned with tweaking, is as the brain is needing those neurotransmitters present, if you're not trying, the individual may think they're trying to keep or sustain that, but they eventually deplete the neurotransmitters, meaning they're using and dumping them faster than the brain cells are making them. And oftentimes, at the end of a binge and a tweaking period, days, weeks, the individual will literally crash because their brain is depleted for a period of time.
Now, you've used the phrase tweaking and the phrase binge. What to you is a methamphetamine binge?
Binge is back-to-back use, so it doesn't have to mean every 3 hours or every 10. It just means that as the individual's sensation or high or euphoria is wearing off, they're administering the next dose. So they are back-to-back sequential. So I would say binge would be 2 days and more, so from 2 days on of repetitive dosing.
Would you expect that someone coming out of a 3-day methamphetamine binge would be able to make rational decisions?
No.
Would you expect that someone could engage after a 3-day methamphetamine binge in calm and cool reflection?
No, that's counter to what we describe meth patients appearing.
Does methamphetamine affect the human sleep cycle?
Substantially. The sleep depends on the neurotransmitters and their proper sensitivity and production. We also refer to it as sleep hygiene. So for proper length, proper depth, number of REM cycles, and what we refer to as restorative sleep, it depends on the brain to be functioning properly.
And does methamphetamine use cause weight loss?
It does. Individuals have appetite suppression with central nervous system stimulants. They also have increased metabolism, increased body activity, fidgeting, moving, hard for them to sit still. So with that, an individual will, with regular and routine use, will actually become thinner and lower percent body fat, which is also, if you ever get to see pictures of progression from someone who didn't use to later examples of photos with their progressive use, it's quite dramatic.
Is it a dangerous situation?
Nutritionally, absolutely.
And also physically?
Yes.
To lose the weight that often happens in a methamphetamine addiction?
Yes, and the neurologic changes.
Dr. Buffington, I think we have one more slide that we have not looked at, and I think that it explains all, go back one, I believe. There, no, not that one. That one, on the
Yes.
right-hand side.
Yes.
And if you could just explain to the jury again what that is.
So I mentioned that one of the unique things about methamphetamine is it's not just capable of disrupting one neurotransmitter, but four of the most important. Those are neurotransmitters that are all part of the proper functioning of thought and mood and sleep and judgment. So they're critical to that. But then they're also responsible for many adverse side effects and complications. So what we see in this slide is that he definitely needs proper neurotransmitter sensitivity and functioning based on his underlying conditions, and that the combination of prescription medication and illicit substances is creating what we refer to as a neurotransmitter storm. It's just, they're chaotic. It's not at appropriate levels. It's not behaving for appropriate durations of time, and it's affecting not one, but four different critical neurotransmitters.
And Dr. Buffington, is addiction to a substance like methamphetamine a medical issue?
Most definitely.
Is the addiction a disease?
Most definitely.
That's all I have, Your Honor.
Cross.
Sorry, wait, just one moment. Go ahead. Just two more questions. If an individual has a cocaine addiction, could the substitution of methamphetamine for cocaine constitute a relapse?
Most definitely. It is the same pharmacologic category in terms of central nervous system stimulants, and a similar but more intense high than the cocaine would have been.
In other words, is it unusual for an addict to relapse and substitute one drug for another?
No, and in fact, methamphetamine is typically easier to find and less expensive, and more powerful at its symptoms, so it's a sad but all too frequent pattern.
Thank you. No other questions?
Cross.
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Doctor, going back to your qualifications, you said that your Pharm D that's what you have?
That is correct.
And you said that that's the highest level of degree offered in pharmacology?
Pharmacology and clinical application, correct.
Yes, sir. But in fact, there's a PhD as well.
That's a different degree, not a higher.
Okay, but that would involve more rigorous study.
No, it actually involves less. It's research-based.
So if it's research-based, then it would be useful to have a PhD in order to complete scholarly articles and things of that nature, correct?
Only if the research is laboratory-based. Clinical research would be more applicable to the PharmD.
Okay, so you did not feel that you needed that degree in order to do what you do?
Oh, no, not at all. It's different. And matter of fact, a PhD doesn't have any clinical or patient activities.
But you would agree that your degree, the PharmD, is the same degree that a pharmacist at Publix or Walgreens has, correct?
Very similar, but it also, those individuals wouldn't have the postgraduate specialty training.
Yes, sir. But essentially, you're a pharmacist.
Correct. And a pharmacist is a pharmacologist.
And you mentioned to the jury that you had authored several scientific articles throughout the course of your professional career. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
But none of them were in reference to methamphetamine. Is that correct?
There may be one or two. They wouldn't be titled that, but they would be about substance use disorders.
But it wasn't specifically on meth and the side effects of meth, correct?
As I stated, correct.
And you have never, you said that your degree deals in clinical, the clinical side of things, essentially, correct?
Clinical and forensic.
And you've never done any clinical research on people or studies on people using meth and the side effects, correct?
No, just patient care activities.
You testified that you bill at the same rate for the state and defense, that's correct, right?
And patient care, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. But it's fair to say that you testify more for the defense than you do for the state.
I don't have an exact number, but I would agree with that. I'm testified for both, but I do think if you were to weigh them, I think it's more for defense over the years.
And in the course of your work during this case, you said, I'm going to go through the list, but you said, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but you said you reviewed reports about the incident,
Correct.
and you watched the video of the incident, correct?
That was included, yes, sir.
And you conducted an interview with the defendant,
That is correct.
and that interview took about 2 hours.
That is correct.
And during that 2-hour interview, that was enough time to go over his entire life history, essentially, including drug usage?
For the topics I was covering, yes, sir.
And did he discuss the incident itself with you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And that was all covered in 2 hours?
That was.
And you reviewed, I believe, 2 deposition transcripts, correct?
Correct.
And those transcripts were of Noel Gale, correct?
Yes, sir.
And Brianna Toll.
That is correct.
And your understanding is Noel Gale is the person who was in the car with him when it happened, right?
Yes.
And Brianna Toll was the girlfriend at the time who attempted to come pick him up at the ballpark.
That's my understanding.
So in doing your evaluation of the defendant and speaking to him and doing your analysis in this case, you didn't find that it was important to speak to any family members?
No, sir. It was a clinical interview of Mr. McDowell.
So it would not have been useful to your opinion in the case to speak to family members who saw him day in and day out for years on it?
It wasn't part of the clinical interview, no, sir.
So it would not have been any use to you to hear about the time period during which he began a so-called downward spiral?
It may have, but even in clinical practice settings, it's pretty rare that we're interviewing family members.
Well, it may have been useful, but you just decided you didn't need to in this case.
No, sir, it wasn't part of the standard process.
And you did not interview any of his friends from around this time period or prior to, correct?
Correct.
In fact, you didn't even interview the people who you read their deposition transcripts.
Correct. That was provided in that dialogue.
Did you review during the course of your evaluation in this case other expert reports?
No, sir.
Okay, so any history that he gave to other experts that were doing work on this case, in your opinion, it was not relevant to your consideration?
Well, I was doing my own evaluation. I didn't need any other experts to do my evaluation.
Fair. I'm not asking you whether you needed other experts. You're definitely qualified to do your own evaluation. My question is it relevant to you to hear and see what he may have told other experts?
Possibly, but that was not made available to me, nor am I aware of anything that contradicts.
Well, it wasn't made aware, or it wasn't made available to you, but you could certainly have asked for it.
Judge, I'm going to object to his argument.
It's overruled.
You certainly could have asked for additional material, correct?
I could have, but didn't need it for doing the work that I was requested to do.
Okay. So, whenever you were speaking to the defendant about his drug usage, did he indicate to you that that cocaine was more problematic for him than methamphetamine?
No, sir.
Is that something that would possibly affect your decision in this case?
No, sir, because the way you frame the hypothetical is that it could have been, are you saying intensity of effect? Are you saying how many years he was exposed to and using cocaine? But he just didn't state that it was more problematic. It was clearly in his substance use history pattern. We covered that.
Yes, sir. But he never told you that it was more problematic than methamphetamine, and that he recognized that.
Well, and it may have been. It may have been based on price and access and usage, and they're very similar products in terms of effect, as we've already covered today.
Did he tell you that he was never actually addicted to methamphetamine?
No.
Did he tell you that he enjoyed using methamphetamine because it allowed him to function and not appear high?
That's what many people think. That's not the case when you look at methamphetamine users.
Well, you don't know that, right?
No, I do know that many people think it doesn't affect them, and we clinically observe substantial effects.
Well, you didn't clinically observe him under the influence of meth, correct?
Correct. I was answering the question that methamphetamine users may think it causes no external effects, and it typically does.
Typically. But
That's-
again, you didn't observe Mr. McDowell high when you conducted the interview with him, correct?
No, but we were discussing multiple days' use of repetitive use and the types of symptoms he was experiencing at that time, and methamphetamine at that time was the primary substance.
Did he tell you that, additionally, and it's kind of building on the last question, but did he tell you that he enjoyed using meth because he did not feel out of control, unlike with other drugs?
I don't recall that statement, but that's not uncommon for an addict to say about whatever substance they think they're managing.
And I believe you stated on direct that Mr. McDowell was in his 30s when he actually started using meth, correct?
Correct.
So that is after the brain is fully formed.
Right, but after and simultaneous with years of other substance abuse.
And he stated, speaking of other substance abuse, he stated that he began using alcohol and marijuana when he was in his teens, correct?
That is correct.
And that is well prior to when he was deployed overseas.
Correct. Matter of fact, he had stated that he had to try to reduce, cut back, or minimize substances that he was using when trying to get into and go for deployment.
And just to clarify, you're a pharmacologist, not a psychopharmacologist, correct?
Well, that is a component.
It's a component, but that's not what you are.
Well, I'm not aware of anyone who is just that.
I mean, you may have taken courses on that during your studies, correct?
Correct, and it's a high percentage of the clinical work that we do, so I'm not aware of someone who is just a
Well, I'll take it one
neuropsychologist.
step further. You're not a psychologist, correct?
No, it is a component of what we do.
You are not a psychiatrist either. are
That
you?
is correct.
And you're certainly not a medical doctor.
That is correct.
The defendant in this case, to your knowledge, was not drug tested, correct?
That is my understanding.
And you never received any laboratory reports indicating what levels he had in his system at the time?
You are correct.
Are you familiar with Pervitin? I think that's how you say it?
Not as you're stating it.
Okay, so you're not familiar with the drug, an early form of methamphetamine that the Germans administered to their troops to keep them alert and awake during World War II?
So that would have been another brand name. That is what I was referring to. It was originally developed for long flight pilots to maintain clarity during flying, but eventually proved to have many psychiatric problems.
Okay. Well, let's talk about psychiatric problems and things of that sort, even though you're not a psychiatrist, correct?
Correct, but it's a component of what we do to assess how a medication is working, good or bad.
All right, I'm going to put your slide back up here. Can you see that on your screen?
Now I can.
You can or you can't?
Can.
You can.
Yes, sir.
So there is a circle at, well, before I get there, let me ask you this question. A person could experience any or all of these symptoms regardless of whether they're on drugs, correct?
Yes, based on their underlying psychopathology.
Certainly. And they could experience these symptoms from a number of different substances, not just to include meth, correct?
That is true.
And I want to discuss with you the first circle at the very top there, impaired memory.
Yes, sir.
Are you aware of whether the defendant in this case had impaired memory of the incident?
He was having blackouts during that period of time. Now, if you're saying specifically the incident, I think he's pretty clear on what he recalled.
Okay. And I just want to clarify as well, are you aware that he testified the other day?
Yes, sir. I had the opportunity to see that.
You did see it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you heard exactly what he said.
Yes, sir.
And you would agree with me that based on what he said, he had a very clear memory of what transpired?
Of the sequence of events, yes, sir.
Okay, so he did not suffer from impaired memory based on his meth usage on that night?
I would agree, as you gave the caveat on that night.
And the next circle to the right, for ease, I'll circle it so that we all know what you're talking about.
Yes, sir.
Hold on one second. Can you see it still? Oh, there it is. It popped back up. Poor decision making.
Yes.
I circled it in green. So in reference to poor decision making, you would agree with me that there's a difference between a bad decision versus a decision without any thought whatsoever.
Correct.
In other words, it kind of relates to another circle on the left side, impulsivity. Like you would agree that impulsivity is where someone makes a decision, or they don't even make a decision, they just react.
Correct. Without thinking or of the ramifications.
Okay. So you would agree that shooting a police officer was a bad decision, right?
It was.
Okay. But you can't say that it was a decision without any thought.
No, as he testified, he had thought. That didn't mean that it was proper or cogent.
Sure, but he thought about it, based on.
Yeah, yes, no one is attempting to state that altered mental health means a person can't think, can't recall, or can't talk. They're awake, they're functioning.
So just to clarify, as far as the poor decision-making, you would agree that while it was a bad decision, it was not a decision without thought?
Well, of course, but the poor decision-making isn't referring to just a mild poor decision. It is impaired cogent thought.
You would agree that people who aren't on drugs make bad decisions every day?
Right, and that's not what we're talking about here.
Right. I think we're on the same page.
I think we are.
Going to a circle on the left top. I'll circle that for you. Psychosis.
Yes, sir.
Just briefly, there is no evidence in this case that you're aware of, and no statements that he made either during his testimony or during your evaluation with him that would suggest that he was experiencing psychosis.
Yes, there would be.
And there was evidence of that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and tell me what that was.
So psychosis is a detachment from reality. It doesn't mean the individual isn't communicating. It doesn't mean the individual thinks they're on Pluto. It can mean that the individual is improperly interpreting their surroundings or their activities. So he was experiencing what are referred to as shadow people. That's where with methamphetamine, as I'm sitting here talking to you now, I might see movement over here. And you could say, well, was it a light bulb that flickered, or was it, no, it looked like a person walking next to me, and there's no one there. So under the realm of psychoses, hallucinations, impaired thought, detachment from reality, I could have thought that as I came in the room today that one of the jurors was going to attack me. But I came here and I testified, and I could state that later. It was a memory. But it didn't mean that it was a reality or something based in reality.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll take credit for that. I think that was just a bad question. So in reference to the incident itself, when the murder occurred, there is no evidence that he was experiencing psychosis.
Well, he was in a 3-day binge of methamphetamine, having these types of symptoms, and his perception that an officer was out to get him, solely to get him, was not based in a reality. That there were thoughts that he was expressing that were not, and he stated himself in his own testimony.
I'm going to ask you again. At the time the murder occurred, there was no evidence of psychosis, correct?
Objection, asked and answered.
I'm going to allow it. Overruled.
Yes, sir. I think that the way I answered the question was the statement, is that in the interview with Mr. McDowell about the time and the moments surrounding, he was having irrational, non-real thoughts about his surroundings. Yes, sir.
So he told you that he thought Deputy Moyers was a member of Al-Qaeda?
No, sir, I didn't say that.
Or did he recognize that Deputy Moyers was a police officer?
He did, but he also thought Deputy Moyers, prior to that, was specifically out to get him. And he was trying to not engage with him.
He realized that he had outstanding arrest warrants, correct?
Correct.
And he thought that there were members of the police force that were out to arrest him, correct?
Correct.
And he thought that if Deputy Moyers made contact with him and got him out of the car, he was going back to jail, correct?
He was certain of that, where that wasn't a certainty.
Well, you would agree that it is a certainty that if you have an outstanding arrest warrant and police make contact with you and verify who you are and that you have a warrant, you're going to jail.
Objection, outside the scope of this witness knowledge.
Overruled.
You would agree with that? Do you need me to restate the question?
No, sir, I don't know what would happen with any degree of certainty in that interaction. What happened was tragic, but I don't know what the other options could have been.
You don't know. Well, let me address two things you said. You said you don't know for certain what happened?
No, sir, I said I don't know for certain what could have happened.
What do you mean, what could have happened?
The alternatives of their interaction that evening. They were apparently close to each other at a gas station prior to where this event occurred, and then they were together at the scene where Officer Moyers was shot.
Well, he told you what the alternatives were, right? I mean, he said that during his testimony.
Well, he stated many things that he didn't think were real or rational, yes.
He stated during his testimony, you correct because you saw the testimony,
I did.
that he considered fleeing. He considered running.
He did. He was in a fight or flight mode.
Well, that's beyond the scope of your expertise, isn't it?
No, that's the pharmacologic effect that we've been discussing.
Well, fight or flight, I mean, that's fine. I think that we'll have other people testify to that, but fight or flight,
Judge, I'm going to object to the editorial comment.
All right, just stick with the question.
fight or flight, you would agree, refers to a reaction. Again, it kind of goes to the impulsivity, but reaction without thought, like a physiological reaction.
Correct. And as he stated in his testimony, that is what he was feeling without judgment, without ramifications. It was to either flee or not be taken.
And he said he was going to try to talk his way out of it.
I didn't say that. They were having a dialogue, so that when you say what are the other options, there could have been many.
Well, let me just go through a couple more things and then we'll move on to something else.
Yes, sir.
You would agree that he lied about his name, correct?
Yes,
And you would agree that he came up with a story that his license was in his pocket in Jacksonville, so he didn't have his license.
I think I recall that.
And you would agree that he said that the vehicle must have insurance because it's a lift vehicle, correct?
I don't recall the reference to Lyft, but I do recall that he knew it was a stolen vehicle.
The bottom line is that he spent a good period of time trying to talk his way out of the situation.
Yeah, there was a dialogue between the officer and him.
And based on what you viewed in the video and what he told you and then what he testified to, there was nothing about that that was patently psychotic.
No, as I stated, in and around that time, he was having hallucinations, auditory, visual. He himself states that he had no sense of emotion or rationalization on his actions.
Doctor, I think the bottom line is with your testimony that
Judge, I'm going to object again. It's improper for the state attorney to state what they think.
It's overruled.
I think the bottom line with your testimony is that methamphetamine is bad for the brain, correct?
Extremely. And symptoms were present at and around that time.
And you would agree that it's a personal decision to take any drug.
It is. It also when in an addiction, it becomes very difficult to refrain from a subsequent dose, especially with methamphetamine.
But you would agree that one does not become addicted to a drug until they make the decision to take it.
That's part right answer. The other could be that it's a prescription medication that they're being told to take, and that has addictive potential.
But it is not your understanding that the defendant at any time in his life was prescribed methamphetamine.
You are correct.
In other words, he chose to take that illicit substance himself.
That is correct.
And you would agree that while you have the video that you watched, you have his testimony, and you have his evaluation, you do not know how methamphetamine affected him.
Well, based on an understanding of the pharmacology and the symptoms he was experiencing, but if you're stating, do I know the dose or the concentration in his system at the moment, I don't.
And the next question, obviously based on that, is drugs, any drug affects anyone differently.
It can.
And you do not know specifically at the time this murder occurred how that drug was affecting Mr. McDowell.
Correct. Just that his symptoms and his demeanor and cognitive status are consistent with methamphetamine use.
Judge, could I have 1 second?
You may.
No further questions.
All right, redirect.
Dr. Buffington, the state ask you about Mr. McDowell actually taking the first hit or use of methamphetamine as a personal choice, do individuals often use illicit substances to self-medicate?
They do. In fact, it's a major issue in all psychiatric care is that patients don't want to take something they've been told to take and want more control over the time, the dose, the amount, the management of that. So it's a common problem in psychiatric care.
And is it possible that someone diagnosed with depression would self-medicate? Is that a common practice that you see?
Unfortunately, yes. And with the symptoms that this type of product produces, the type of intense rush and euphoria, it's a bad recipe.
And assume for a moment that 4 mental health professionals, 3 psychiatrists and 1 psychologist, have diagnosed Patrick McDowell with post-traumatic stress disorder. Is that a condition that you see in your practice that people self-medicate for?
Yes, both with central nervous system depressants like alcohol and benzodiazepines, as well as stimulants.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions.
All right, the witness may step down, and he is also excused, I assume. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. All right, as witness is making his way off the stand, call your next witness.
Call Miss Amanda Mills. Did she step to the restroom just for a second?
All right.
Just have a moment.
Counsel, do you have another witness to call? Out of order.
Yes, sir. Call Mr. Daniel White.
Sorry.
You may proceed.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Would you please introduce yourself to the jury and spell your name for Madam Court Reporter?
My name is Amanda Mills. It's Amanda, last name Mills. And yeah,
Where do you live, Ms. Mills?
Jacksonville, Florida.
How long have you lived there?
About 6 years now.
And are you married?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you have children?
I do.
How many kids do you have?
I have 4.
Where are you currently employed?
I work for a 5-star veteran center.
And could you describe for the jury what that center is, what it does, the function of it?
So we are transitional housing for military veterans who are suffering from PTSI, TBI, addiction issues, or just homelessness.
So you house these veterans who?
Yes, sir. They live with us for up to a year.
About how many veterans at a time can you accommodate?
We accommodate 39 veterans.
And are usually full or at capacity?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And what is your job title at the 5-Star Veterans Center?
I'm lead case manager.
And describe that role for the jury. What is a lead case manager?
I assist the veterans that are housed with us with employment, education, transportation, and VA medical appointments.
How long have you been in that role?
About 6 years now.
Okay, so the same amount of time you've been in Jacksonville?
Yes.
If you had to estimate in that time, 6 years, how many veterans do you think you've assisted with housing, employment, VA benefits, all the things you referenced?
That would be veterans that lived at the facility and outside. You're looking at over 230.
Do you have any specialized training for this role?
I did certifications and classes. I'm also an RN from Texas.
So you're you have an RN
Yes.
degree? Okay. And as far as the classes, the training that you took, could you tell me about that?
Addiction specialist, community service, a CPAT, which is a patient care technician, and then case management classes.
And you've had some of your own struggles as well?
Yes.
In this area of addiction, and as far as treatment and having to seek it for yourself?
Yes, I am also a recovering addict.
Okay, so you have a unique perspective in helping them
Yes.
dealing with those issues, I believe.
Yes, sir.
Do you know Mr. Patrick McDowell seated over here at the defense table?
Yes, I do.
How do you know Mr. McDowell?
He was a veteran that came through our facility.
And when was that?
The first time I met him was around, I'm guessing around 2019. He came to the facility through a Veterans Treatment Court.
And prior to that, were you aware that he was in the Matrix inpatient program in the Duval County Jail?
Yes, the mentor from the Veterans Treatment Court contacts us whenever they have someone that they would like us to assist.
And who was that mentor?
David Abramowitz.
And so were you the case manager for Mr. McDowell?
Yes, I was.
And were you assisting him with the things we discussed, employment and VA benefits?
Yes, sir.
And I'm guessing you would have spoken to him at length during that time?
We did have a couple of conversations. My office was right outside of his room, so we kind of saw each other.
Did he talk to you at that time about his goals or aspirations in treatment?
Yes, he
What did he tell you?
spoke of trying to be successful and to be there for his son
Okay. He talked about building a better relationship with his child and other
and his
family,
family.
and rebuilding other relationships.
Yes, sir.
Did he appear to you to be actively engaged in his treatment?
Yes, sir.
Did it seem like something he was taking seriously?
He was very active at that time. He was really goal-oriented and wanting to get the VA and then also going back to work.
Speaking of work, was he employed during that time?
Yes, I believe that he was working with JDOG, which was a construction, they remove construction trash and stuff like that.
Like a junk removal?
Yes.
That's the J.
Sorry.
Okay. He was also involved, y'all had some community involvement as well for the veterans with
Yes.
groups in the community, is that right?
Yes.
I'd like to show you, if I could, what's previously been marked as Defense Exhibit 109. Are you able to see that on your screen?
Yes.
Okay, what is that a picture of?
That is Patrick McDowell with 2 horses.
Okay, and where was that picture taken?
That is at the North Florida Special Education School off of Mill Creek, which is about 2 blocks from our facility.
All right, and what is that school, if you could describe it for me?
They teach children who are physically and mentally challenged. They have the equine therapy there to help the children. And our guys would go down there and assist the children in taking care of the horses, showing them how to take care of them, and then they would lead the children on the horses for the course.
Okay, so it's equine therapy for the kids in the specialized school?
Yes, but
Special needs.
it also helps veterans,
Sure, because they're
anybody.
giving back to the community, correct? Now, at some point, Mr. McDowell did leave the program.
Yes.
Was there a cause, something that triggered that? Do you recall?
Honestly, I cannot recall exactly why he left. I just know that he left rather abruptly.
Was this around the time of COVID?
Yes, sir.
When COVID hit, did you have issues with any other veterans during that time, falling off track or
Yes, I did, sir.
leaving the programs?
Yes.
He wasn't unique in that regard.
No, sir. During COVID, it was very difficult, especially for the treatment courts.
All right. I wanted to ask you about, as a drug addict, they're working with drug addicts, is relapse, is that a common thing?
If you don't relapse, you're going to relapse. It's going to happen.
That's just sort of.
It's part of the growth, part of the being better.
And if someone does that mean that they just weren't serious or they were thumbing their nose at an opportunity?
No.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Cross?
Good morning, Ms. Mills.
Good morning.
Good to see you again.
You too.
In talking about the 5-star program, this is headed up by Colonel Loving, correct?
Yes.
And he is probably one of the foremost advocates for veterans in Northeast Florida,
Yes, he is.
maybe even in the United States, based upon his involvement, correct?
Yes.
And the 5-star house is set up to house 39 veterans, correct?
Yes.
You help them in getting benefits as a case manager, correct?
Yes, we would get them with the veteran service officers, making sure that they apply for the benefits that they deserve.
You help them get VA appointments.
Yes, we do.
You provide transportation if necessary for counseling, drug therapy, things of that nature.
Yes, sir.
You actually help them get jobs, and you had indicated that at this time at 5-star, Mr. McDowell was actually working at J-Dog Junk Removal. Basically, 5-star is set up to be a supportive system to provide anything a veteran needs so that they can become an independent, productive member of society.
That is our ultimate goal.
And these services are free of charge. There's a housing cost.
Right,
The
yes.
services-
Sorry, the services are free of charge, but they do have financial responsibilities while they are at 5-star.
Rent and things of
Yes.
that nature. And you've worked with over 232 veterans in 5-star during your time there.
Yes, sir.
And Mr. McDowell was a veteran who came to 5-star about in that first year or so after you started working with 5-star.
Yes.
And I think you already indicated that your office was actually directly across the hallway for where this defendant's room was.
At his first stay, yes.
At the first stay. And when we're talking about the first stay, this is at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, once he was discharged from the in-custody portion of the Matrix program.
Yes.
So right around the turn of the year 2020.
Yes, sir.
You said he was being successful in this venture. He was productive, correct?
Yes, sir. He seemed very involved.
For 3 months. Because COVID hit, and once COVID hit, he sort of went off the grid. Is that a yes?
Yes, I'm sorry, yes, sir.
You were still right across the hallway when COVID hit, right?
Yes, sir.
And you have no idea why he went off the grid at that point.
No, sir, I do not.
But the services that we just went over, they were still all available, correct?
Yes, sir.
Those supportive services, even though Veterans Treatment Corps, because of the lockdown, lost in-person contact with individuals. That wasn't true with Five Star.
No, sir. We tried to keep up with that as much as possible.
And all the services that were available through Five Star, right across the hallway from where this defendant was staying, those were still available to this defendant when COVID hit.
Yes, sir.
You referenced David Abramowitz. He was his Veterans Court mentor, correct?
Yes, sir.
The first time he came for those 3 months in 2019, 2020, that was because Mr. Abramowitz referred him to you all through Veterans Treatment Corps.
Yes, sir.
But the second visit wasn't through Veterans Treatment Corps.
No, sir.
The second visit was in 2021, after he was released from jail and placed on probation by the court.
Yes, sir.
And during that second visit, it wasn't Mr. Abramowitz who got him into the program. It was the relationship that his family, in particular his father, had with Colonel Loving.
Yes, sir.
And so at that time in 2021, his family was still supportive
Yes, sir.
and assisted him in getting, again, these wraparound services that were available to assist him become a productive member of society.
Yes, sir.
But you noticed a difference in Patrick at the second visit, correct?
The second time I had contact with him, yes. It wasn't the same Patrick.
There was a lack of spark in him.
There was no light behind his eyes anymore.
And we know, and you know, based on conversations with this defendant, that he had spent nearly an entire year in jail in Georgia, correct?
Yes, sir.
Sort of a forced abstinence off of substances.
Yes, sir.
And part of his probationary conditions were for him to actually maintain and continue substance abuse treatment while he was living at Five Star.
Yes, sir.
And at this second visit in 2021, again, the defendant just suddenly disappeared,
Yes, sir.
fell off the grid again,
Yes, sir.
despite the availability still at this point in time of all the services that Five Star had to offer.
Yes, sir.
But before he fell off the grid and disappeared again, you actually had a conversation with him about his time in the Georgia jail, correct?
I did, sir.
And he told you in that conversation he was never going back to jail.
He said that he could not go back to jail, that he had to succeed.
But he said he was never going back to jail.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. I don't have any further questions.
Redirect.
I just want to clarify that when COVID occurred in March of 2020, Mr. McDowell was not the only veteran who went off the grid
No, sir.
there at Five Star, is that right?
That is correct.
That happened to several of the veterans that were staying there.
Yes, sir.
State asked about this statement about not going back to jail. When Mr. McDowell said that to you, how did you understand that?
At that time, I was standing in his room, and we were looking at photos of his son in the footlocker, and stated that he cannot go back to jail.
Did you take it like he still had a desire to get clean, to try?
I feel like he wanted to do it again, to try again, to be there for his family and show them that he could do it.
That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
All right, the witness may step down, and you're excused. Let's see, is the next witness going to take, how long do you think that person's going to take? 30 minutes? Or, tell you what, we're going about an hour and a half. It's a good time to take a mid-morning break. So everybody put your notes down, take a step back to the jury room and just take a few moments to yourself, and we'll bring you back here momentarily. Please do not communicate about the case with anyone. Thank you. All right. Anything else, council? Then we'll just be in recess. We'll get started about 10 after.
All right.
1:00. All right, you may proceed.
Sir, could you tell us your full name?
Ryan Challoner Winton Hall, MD.
Can you spell Ryan and the,
A-A-N, Challoner is C-H-A-L-O-N-E-R, Winton is W-I-N-T-O-N.
thank you, sir. And where do you live?
Sanford, Florida.
And what is your occupation?
Psychiatrist with subspecialization in forensics.
And how long have you been a psychiatrist?
I finished my training in 2008 and been practicing in Florida since then. You can argue if some of the training time may count or not, but at least 2008 onward.
And can you just, you have a private practice of psychiatry?
Yes, sir.
Can you describe the nature of your practice, what you do, what kinds of patients you deal with?
Sure. I have an outpatient office. I deal a lot with depression, OCD, anxiety, PTSD. Because I'm a small office, I don't have a lot of schizophrenic patients, but I do have one or two that suffer from psychotic episodes at times. I'm affiliated with University of Central Florida, so at times I'll do research projects with some of the medical students or residents. I've also had residents shadow me as a teaching experience. I'm also affiliated with University of South Florida in Tampa. They have a forensics program, so I work with some of their forensic fellows down there in psychiatry. And I'm an adjunct professor at Berry Law School in Orlando, where I teach a course on law and psychiatry.
Traumatic stress disorder?
Yes, sir.
Can you, your educational background?
To Johns Hopkins for my undergraduate, got a degree in biology and psychology, went to Georgetown for medical school, then went back to Hopkins for my internship and residency, then did a fellowship training up at Case Western Reserve in forensic psychiatry.
Are you licensed as a psychiatrist in the state of Florida?
Yes, sir.
Have you previously been licensed in other states?
Yes, sir. I trained in Maryland, so I was in Maryland and I was licensed in Ohio. For a brief period of time, I was doing some work out of New Mexico, so I had a New Mexico license for a while, even though I wasn't living there.
And what certifications do you possess?
The basic one is the forensic subspecialty is a certification through the board. I've done additional trainings at times, but I'm not sure you'd necessarily argue that it's a certification. University of South Florida puts on a 3-day course to do competency sanities in Florida. So technically, I've done that course and have been certified. But the big one is the forensic subspecialization, which was a year program nationally recognized.
So that means you're board certified in forensic psychiatry?
Yes, sir.
And what is forensic psychiatry?
Psychiatry is an interesting field because we deal with the mind, and mind changes how people think and perceive things. So although there may be times where other branches of medicine end up in court, nobody has ever said my hip replacement caused me to rob a liquor store. So because mental health and perception and threat assessment and understanding of what's going on can be impaired, it's very important for psychiatrists, if they're doing court work, to have subspecialized, know the law a little better than the average physician, as well as understand what goes into certain aspects of the legal system. Also, a lot of times we will end up treating patients who have been found not guilty by reason of insanity or need to be restored to competency. In other words, treat the delusions so they're in a right frame of mind to be able to go to court and to testify relevantly.
What is the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist?
Psychiatrists are medical doctors, so we have done medical school, and we'll often have an MD or DO degree. Psychologists have a PhD, and they don't have necessarily the medical background. They do a little more with statistics and maybe putting together tests or giving tests like IQ tests, things of that nature. Whereas psychiatrists work a lot more with neurology, medications, labs. There may be areas of overlap. We both tend to use what's known as the Diagnostic Statistics Manual to come to diagnoses, but there are some.
And do you belong to the American Psychiatric Association? Are you a distinguished fellow in that association?
Yes, which means that I've been involved, I've served on committees, I've done things in the community. So it's a higher level of membership, and it's an award or a way to distinguish people who have done more than just a general member.
I asked earlier if you have treated patients with PTSD, and you said yes. Have some of those been veterans who have post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of their military service?
Yes.
And as part of your forensic work, have you consulted with lawyers in criminal cases where there are issues about mental health?
Yes.
And have some of those cases been cases where post-traumatic stress disorder was the mental health problem?
Yes.
And have you been qualified to testify in court in the area of psychiatry?
Yes.
Is there a standard definition of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD?
I will say yes and no there. As I mentioned earlier, we have a diagnostic criteria that's called the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. It gets updated about every 10 years, 15 years. The diagnosis of PTSD has been in there since 1980 with the DSM-3, but every new version that comes out, they kind of change the criteria a little bit. So PTSD, I think, is a diagnosis that's in flux, that there is a lot of further redefining. At times, there are people pushing a concept called complex PTSD, which is not in the DSM. So I think you will sometimes have experts argue over whether you should diagnose complex versus just stick with definitions. So the short answer is yes, there are clear diagnostic criteria, but there are some people that debate that we need to expand it or have it a little more further developed.
And you mentioned DSM. Is that just an abbreviation for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders?
Yes, and the American Psychiatric Association has been putting that out, I think since the 1950s, as a way to kind of standardize and have better reliability between evaluators, both clinically and in criminal situations, on what a diagnosis is, how to treat it, how to research it. So it's not used just for court, but it often is very helpful in court.
Can you tell the jury what post-traumatic stress disorder is? What are the criteria? How do you go about diagnosing it?
Post-traumatic stress disorder, when it first came in, was put under the anxiety categories in the DSM. Over time, it's kind of gotten its own categorization now. And it's one of those conditions where you need to have certain criteria met in order to make the diagnosis. So we often refer to A criteria or A categorizations, which is you experienced a trauma. And they have very clear definitions of what a trauma is. So like death of a loved one from a natural cause actually is not a traumatic event per that diagnostic criteria. So it needs to be serious or life-threatening injury, illness, or that it was about to happen. That there needs to be some notion of reliving, which is criteria B, and that's often where you hear people talk about having nightmares or intrusive thoughts, or if they're reminded, having a heart rate change. Then there's criteria C, which is often avoidance, and put simply, either people don't want to talk about it or they don't want to be around physical reminders of it. Criteria D is change in your worldview. A lot of the D symptoms overlap a lot with depression, so it may be a sense of shame, guilt, fear. It may be a sense that the world isn't working the way it's supposed to be. A lot of kind of mental health things that go under the D category. Criteria E is hyperarousal. That's where you run into the sleep disturbances. That's where you run into the anger, the irritability, the scanning your environment, the hyperstartle if you hear a noise that you think's a gunshot. Those are the main symptomatic ones. And then you've got a few other ones, such as the symptoms have to last for a month or longer. Otherwise, we call it acute stress. And again, people are exposed to traumas all the time. People may have a brief period where they think about it more than usual, but it's only if it lasts for a certain period of time that it's ongoing, that we don't normally resolve or cope, that it becomes post-traumatic stress disorder. And then there's the notion that it affects your functionality. So I apologize, I love the DSM, but it's 700 pages. I don't have it all memorized, but I think category F is that it has to affect your functioning. And then there has to be a notion that the effect on functioning is not just due to another cause or drugs or another symptom. So again, sometimes, although I love my field of psychiatry, we're 100 years behind the rest of medicine, we still diagnose off of observations. I don't have a blood test. I wish I did. Cardiologists nowadays can get a blood test and say, yes, you've had a heart attack, yes, you've had congestive heart failure. 50 years ago, they were diagnosing it off of, did you have swelling in your ankles? Unfortunately, psychiatry is still based off of observations. So there can be overlap, there can be times where reasonable people may agree to disagree, but you try and take your observations, you try and look at records over time, you try and look at the pattern in the course. One of the problems with PTSD is that there's what we call a high comorbid, meaning that people have that disorder and another diagnosis. So it could be depression, it could be panic. Substance abuse is very common with diagnosis of PTSD. So you do sometimes have to tease apart what is a PTSD symptom, what is a substance abuse symptom, and when is it kind of all part of the same picture.
By definition, is PTSD a debilitating condition, a serious condition?
Yes, because again, one of the criteria for diagnosable PTSD is that it has to interfere with your functioning. So I would put it at the same level as I would put a major depression, as I would put a panic disorder with agoraphobia, as I would put schizophrenia, that it can severely impact somebody's ability to function, drive, go to work, maintain a relationship, be a parent. And it usually impacts multiple areas of someone's life.
And before it was called PTSD, caused by military problems or service in the military, did it have other names in connection with the military?
Yes, and the original DSM at 3 kind of said that this category was supposed to apply to war, genocide, and kind of rape were the primary 3. Over time, it's expanded a little bit, but that 3 basic is still there. Prior to it being recognized in the 1980s, you often heard terms like shell-shocked, soldier's heart, battle fatigue, and they were, again, put more under an anxiety or depressive condition, but they weren't given their own separate category. And again, I don't often quote Freud, but even going back into the early days, they thought that trauma could cause neurosis or changes or nervous temperament. So the notion that we can be changed by our experiences, sometimes in a negative way, has been around for a long time. But the specific diagnosis of PTSD only came out in the 1980s.
Now I want to ask you about your work in this case involving Patrick McDowell. Were you hired to help with the issues of post-traumatic stress disorder?
I wouldn't say I was hired to help in the issues. I was hired to look to see if he had PTSD and if it was a mitigating factor for his case. I'm not directly involved in his treatment, so I'm independent and separated from treatment in that regard. And that's one of the other reasons you sometimes identify your role. If I was his clinician, I'd be trying to help him with his symptoms. Here, I'm just trying to identify how it may or may not be relevant for his situation.
All right. Thank you for clarifying that. My question wasn't worded correctly. Did you meet with Patrick McDowell in order to do your evaluation?
Yes, I reviewed records prior to meeting him, and then I had about a 4.5 hour evaluation with him.
And what did you, well, let me talk about the records first. In reviewing records, did you review police reports about the shooting and the search for him?
Yes, I did, and as part of that, I also saw some of the footage of the event itself, but also of his apprehension.
All right, and did you review the statements and deposition of Noel Gale
Yes, I believe I did.
and the VA medical records,
Yes.
military records?
Yes, and I want to be careful. I think I had his DD 214 long form. I don't know if I had every piece of record from military, but I had that did discuss his service, where he was. There are times where people will have stolen valor, meaning they claim they did things they didn't. So I always like to look at the DD 214 to make sure where somebody trained, what rank they had, what service they did. So again, I think I reviewed enough of his military records to have a good understanding of what his actual service was.
And did you review depositions of witnesses?
Yes.
And did you yourself interview some of the witnesses on your own?
Yes, by phone. I wasn't necessarily in the same room with them, but I was able to call. Some of them were in different states and at least ask them questions. Most of those occurred after the interview with Mr. McDowell.
And the interviews that you did on your own were of his mother, father, David Abramowitz, Aaron Middleton, and his wife Shauna?
Yes, I believe that's correct. There were one or two others I may have called but not received a call back or left a voicemail. I tried to get in touch with a therapist at the VA who initially treated him. Wasn't able to speak with her, but later read her deposition.
And the materials that you reviewed, are those the kinds of materials that you and other psychiatrists customarily review when you're doing an evaluation like this?
Yes, in general, you want as much information as you can get. We don't always get everything, not always is everything available, but you try and review what is.
And do you believe that you received sufficient information about his life and his case to help you in your evaluation?
Yes, I believed I received enough information to form an opinion, and if I requested something, I believe it was provided.
All right. Now I want to go back to the time that you spent with him. What did you spend the time doing with him? What was your method and what was your goal in meeting with him at the jail?
So one of the reasons we do a fellowship is to kind of learn how to do an interview on one of these cases. We do a very in-depth history. A normal clinical intake history may be an hour to 2 hours. Again, I spent about 4.5 hours with him. So I tried to go from the time of his birth up to his arrest and a little bit after his arrest to kind of figure out what was the factors in his life as a whole, not just related to the military, not just related to his arrest. So we talked about his birth, his childhood, his relationship with his parents, his service in the military, his employment after the military, his relationships, his marriage, his psychiatric symptoms, even psychological. We also looked at medical issues. Sometimes, again, why it's good to have a medical degree is thyroid. Other things could affect someone's functioning, head injuries, things along those lines. So tried to look at all of them going through. And then we also talked about what was his mind state at the day of the event.
Right. And was he cooperative during your meeting with him?
Yes.
Did you believe he was forthcoming with information and telling you about his life?
Yes, and there were some minor discrepancies. For example, when I talked with him, he told me that his son had already been born the first time he went to the VA for treatment. The VA record said his son was going to be born. So though there were some minor discrepancies, I thought they were reasonable and could be explained by just normal forgetting or trying to look back 10 years. I didn't get the sense that he was trying to minimize, lie, or intentionally put out false information.
That was going to be my next question. Do you, as a psychiatrist, consider the fact that people might malinger or feign symptoms in order to get some sort of benefit?
Yes, I always consider that. I've written several papers on detecting malingering in a forensic interview. And malingering is the intentional extreme exaggeration. So there may be times where people try and gild the lily. There may be times where they try and put forth a little bit of a positive spin. That in itself may or may not fully be malingering, but I didn't get the sense that he was intentionally trying to lie, minimize, or blame other things for his actions. And again, I tried to review records ahead of time, so if there was huge discrepancies, I could get a sense of where they were coming from or what could have explained them.
All right, and did you reach conclusions about, after your evaluation, about Mr. McDowell's mental issues?
Yes.
And does he have post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes, I thought he was diagnosed with, or met criteria for PTSD after his time in Iraq, serving as a Marine. If I may just take a brief moment, one of the difference between a clinician and a forensic interview is clinicians usually take people at face value. If somebody's coming in and saying, this is the problem, this is the symptom, we usually believe it and go with it, because otherwise, why would they be there? A forensic eval is supposed to be more objective, and we're often looking back. So one of the advantages I think I had as a forensic interviewer versus a clinic interviewer is I kind of knew more of how the story played out. I had a lot more records. I could see the trajectory and kind of the downhill course. So when I reviewed his VA records, they initially said possible PTSD, rule out adjustment disorder. And again, by the diagnostic manual, if you don't meet full criteria for PTSD, an adjustment disorder would be the appropriate diagnosis to give. So it looked like he had a lot of the symptoms at that time. On reading the deposition of his evaluating psychologist, she said, I just wasn't sure his functioning was impaired enough to get the full PTSD diagnosis 2 to 3 months after being in the Marine Corps. Again, having reviewed all the records in close proximity, I think you could definitely see the functional impairment at that time. So I do think he met criteria, even though he was given a rule-out PTSD versus adjustment disorder.
Let me just interrupt you there to clarify a couple of things.
Sorry.
What you're referring to is the first time he went to the VA to be evaluated for PTSD after he got home from the Marines.
Yes.
That was in April of 2010 when he saw a doctor named Julia Tesh Owen.
Yes, and even prior to getting to her, he had gone in, I believe, in February and had again been complaining of similar symptoms and had kind of been moving through the process until he got to her. So these symptoms seemed to be going on for a period of months, so that would meet the criteria for the duration being longer than 4 weeks. He seemed to report consistent symptoms. His primary reason for coming in was he was worried about his relationship, his irritability, his anger. He was a little more optimistic at that time that maybe I'll be able to go to college, maybe I'll be able to get a job as an EMT, but he was unemployed at that time. So, and there may be times where reasonable people can agree to disagree, so I'm not trying to say that the person at that moment was wrong, but I think his functional impairment was higher than she appreciated in the sense that I know the relationship further went downhill. I know that he wasn't able to get through the community college. I know that he did not get really stable employment and in the close times around him. Now, her initial eval says also, would like to see him an additional follow-up. So put it very simply, she said there's definitely smoke there. I'm not sure there's fire. Myself, having looked back, I think there was smoke and fire at that time.
So at that time, this Dr. Julia Tesh Owen could not predict what would happen in the future, but now looking back, you know what happened in the future, so you're more certain of a diagnosis at that time than she was.
Yes.
Is that fair?
And I understand why she didn't put a full diagnosis down, but again, looking back and knowing more of the trajectory, I do think he meets it at that time.
And he met it at that time, and then what about the triple canopy service? Does that cement even further your diagnosis that he has PTSD?
Yes, he had further events during triple canopy that I think further exacerbated the PTSD or further cemented it in. Then he had events when he was working for Signal 88, which again further added to it. And this is one of the areas where there's debate on what do we do with this diagnosis. Is PTSD a single trauma, or is there a different branch or severity of PTSD that's due to multiple traumas? So again, right now, the DSM doesn't distinguish between those two. Who knows what the future generations will. But I do think he had clear symptoms. There may be room to argue whether or not it was full symptoms after the Marines. I think definitely after triple canopy that we can see functional impairment and worsening of symptoms. And then after 2015, when he stopped working as a security officer, that it was further going down and downhill.
Right. And concerning your opinion, was he still suffering from PTSD at the time he shot Deputy Moyers?
Yes.
And is it your opinion that his PTSD had either a direct or indirect causal connection to the shooting of Deputy Moyers?
Yes.
I want to ask, what were the conditions that he faced that were important to you in both the Marines and triple canopy that would have been the experiences that caused PTSD?
Part of it is the Marines, their mentality is always we're the best, we do things that others don't do, we're the first in, we're the last out. So Marines often rely very heavily on the culture. If it breaks down, they often feel a lot more shame and guilt afterwards. So a broken Marine is often a lot harder to put back together than somebody in the Army and the Navy due to how they are trained and how they are brought in. My father was a Navy psychiatrist who worked a lot with the POWs coming back from Vietnam, and he said the Marines were always the hardest for him to put back together. So that was part of it. Then it's often hard for people to ask for help, especially Marines, because they're worried about how that'll impact their future. He did go to the VA in 2010, and there's some records of him going back in 2012. So there were times where he did try and do treatments. There were times where he did actually take medications. He had some side effects, which unfortunately can occur with a medicine called Zoloft, so he stopped it. But how he was being treated seemed consistent with a lot of the symptoms he was reporting. For example, the VA put him on a medicine called Prazolam, which is an alpha blocker. Originally, we used it for blood pressure, but we found that it helps stop some of the hyperactive symptoms, helps with the nightmares, and helps with sleep. So it appears that the VA was treating him for symptoms consistent with what he was reporting. Over time, though, for whatever reason, he started to self-medicate, and I think that's where the drugs really took off. And again, while he was doing work for security details, he knew he was going to be drug tested. There was some minor slips there, but the major slips occurred after 2015 when he was no longer employed, and it just went down a bad rabbit hole. So again, I think the PTSD predates. I think the PTSD was a factor, and again, I'm not going to say it's the only factor, but was a factor that led to the substances. Once the substances were in play, it becomes a lot harder to treat either the substance addiction or the PTSD, and there's several studies out there that talk about that difficulty in active duty or former military on comorbid conditions.
Were his experiences in the Marines and in Triple Canopy the kinds of experiences that can cause post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes. And again, you always have to be careful about people maybe gilding the lily or exacerbating or exaggerating a little bit of the Marine Corps experience. But when I looked through the DD-214, there was specific reference of him being heavily involved in airlifting or evacuating a Marine that had been shot. Now, I've seen some other reports that say, was it enemy fire or was it an accidental discharge within a vehicle? But no matter what, he was exposed to a life-threatening injury or wound, was directly involved with it. So by the documents I had, I could clearly say he was exposed to a traumatic event in the Marines. He also reports other times such as indirect fire, mortars, rockets, and you can sometimes argue at what stage is it truly life-threatening, but, people would take pot shots. One of the reasons I don't think he was malingering is he said, when I was in the Marines, I never fired back. They were never close enough to shoot back, even though there were times where we were concerned. He also went out on multiple patrols, so when you read the records, one talks about he was in charge of the first 20, and then he went and did 30 in a different area, and he was often the team lead. Now, again, he was with the colonel, so the colonel was in charge of everything, but I think he had a leadership position in the vehicle he was in and was responsible for men under him. So some of the literature talks about the groups that have the highest rate of PTSD are the sergeants, the E4s to the E9s, because they're not only responsible for themselves, but for their men. And, when you look at his records, they talk about him taking that very seriously, doing additional training, zeroing the weapons. So when he says, I was worried about my men, from best I can tell from reviewing his records, his actions are consistent with that.
Do you know what the term kinetic activity means? It's a military term.
I've heard it used in different ways, and I've written some papers on the effects of bombings, explosions, and terrorism. So usually when we're talking kinetic, we're talking about a projectile wound, shrapnel, something of that nature. If you're talking about an IED or explosive force, that would be more non-kinetic. The odds of survival of straight kinetic is usually a little bit higher, but it's also very painful, whereas if you get hit by an explosion, there may be higher risks of post-concussive syndrome. To put it simply, the brain may rattle around a bit more with an explosive force, and you can get more torsional effects that can lead to more micro damage and bleedings and capillary breakage.
In order to get PTSD, does a Marine have to have engaged in, gun-to-gun battle, shooting back and forth with somebody, or troops in contact, actually in contact with the enemy and shooting back and forth?
No. And this is one of those issues where some people may agree or disagree. The DSM-3, when it originally came out, had it as a reasonable person standard, that if the average person thought the trauma was severe enough, that's what you needed. Unfortunately or fortunately, as the different categories have come out, it's become a subjective standard. So it's no longer would the average person think it's enough, it's whether the individual themselves thought their life was in danger or at risk. So when he talks about being exposed to indirect fire, if he was concerned he could be hit or killed, that would be enough to meet criteria A. And again, he never fired his weapon. Now, was he exposed to a traumatic event? Yes, and that's why I say he was directly involved in airlifting out a individual. Now, he was the head radio operator. You know, how much his involvement is, there may be argument, but again, the military record said that he was part of the group that was directly responsible for that. So they're seeing the aftermath of a direct threat or violence where somebody could have been injured and died. He also talked about, and I don't have independent to confirm this, but that one of his friends was caught up in an explosion and lost his foot, and that he saved the boot and gave it back to him later. So I know, if that story is accurate, that he has been exposed to this. I focused mostly on his time in the Marines. There was additional exposures when he was at Triple Canopy. He talked about one of his friends, I believe Sanchez, got shot when they were out on a patrol, and his responsibility was to help document it and fill it out afterwards. So although he wasn't there when the exact event occurred, he dealt with the direct aftermath. And we've seen this a lot of times with body handlers. You know, after the Oklahoma City bombing, a lot of the people involved with that got PTSD. I've worked with people that have been on the pile at 9/11 that was involved in the body claiming. Seeing the results and the direct trauma often can lead to PTSD.
This jury has heard testimony that while he was with Triple Canopy, he was responsible for photographing and writing a report after an IED attack in which two men were killed, losing limbs, and that scene was described very vividly by somebody else who saw it as very bloody and gory. Is that the kind of thing, the exposure to that after it had happened, the kind of thing that can cause PTSD?
Yes.
In fact, you mentioned first responders who are not there when an event happens, but come up on the aftermath. That can cause PTSD as well.
Yes, Florida in about 2016 actually changed the disability laws so that first responders could claim disability for PTSD, even though they weren't directly shot at or fired upon, but dealing with the aftermath of severe events, such as car accidents, such as seeing children injured. Again, I don't have independent documentation of this, but one of the things he said that really bothered him was that when he was working perimeter duty for Triple Canopy, that people would bring up their kids that had been burned or disfigured, or bring up adults who had been injured, whether through direct combat or whether it was child abuse. And at this time, he had his son. So I see a lot of folks who do first responder or military work, especially when kids are involved, they say that's even difficult or more difficult.
You mentioned briefly the kind of the PTSD can lead to drug abuse and be combined with drug abuse. Is that because people who have PTSD try to self-medicate with drugs?
Often. And I want to be careful here, and again, I'm trying to be objective. So military increases your risk. If you look at the DSM, they kind of mention certain occupations that increase your risk of PTSD. Military, first responder, those are in the higher category. Not everybody exposed to a trauma will necessarily develop PTSD. And again, I sometimes think people overdiagnose it. So again, that is just one of the things you need. Then it is your response to it later. Could he have been more prone to developing PTSD because he had an abnormal upbringing? You know, parents were divorced, difficulty with step-parents. I'm not saying that those things were traumas that caused it, but they may have been things that made him more prone to developing it later. So why did he get it where another person next to him didn't? Those are all factors you try and look at and why you get a complete history from someone. And there were at least two clear occasions where he looked like he went to the VA to get help. 2010 when he came back as a Marine, and 2012 after Triple Canopy, where he tried to get back on medications. Again, he had some diarrhea with the Zoloft. That's not uncommon. He took amitriptyline, which is an older school antidepressant tricyclic. That's a little sedating to try and help with sleep. He took prazolam. I don't think he found the VA experience rewarding, and that's another problem, is again, a lot of people, due to the avoidance or due to the hyperreactivity, the irritability, the not wanting to talk about it, it's hard for them to engage in treatment and stay engaged. So I think at some point, the self-medicating came into play. And some later records, 2018, 2019, uses the term PTSD and self-medicating, and some of the depots I read talk about him intentionally taking meth to stay up so that when he did sleep, he would just crash because the dreams, the nightmares, and he didn't want to sleep.
And once the PTSD and drug abuse coexist at the same time, does that make it harder to treat?
Yes, because often the withdrawal effects of drugs can mimic or be similar to PTSD effects. So the physical discomfort, the rapid heart rate, things like that may make it difficult. Also, when you're talking to people about their trauma, it can be activating, which then leads to them to want to go out and drink, smoke, whether marijuana or something else.
And is the treatment that is appropriate for drug abuse the same treatment that is appropriate for PTSD?
There can be overlap. A lot of times we use things called cognitive behavioral therapy, but again, it is often harder to treat somebody with PTSD and substance use. So you do sometimes need to take slightly different tactics. You may identify certain symptoms. You may argue that it's more important to deal with the substances first before you dive into the PTSD. And again, there may be varying approaches. So I don't want to say there's one monolithic way to treat someone, but in general, it is harder than just straight out PTSD.
And you said you concluded that Mr. McDowell still had the PTSD at the time that Deputy Moyers was shot. This jury has heard testimony that he had been on a meth binge and had been using meth that very night, not too long before the shooting. Is it hard to attribute percentage of cause of the shooting to either the PTSD or the use of meth?
And I want to be real clear. Meth is bad. Drugs are bad. There are other ways to deal with PTSD besides drugs. You just see that a lot of people with PTSD fall into that pattern. I do think that the methamphetamine in and of itself contributed to what happened with Officer Moyer. I'm not trying to minimize that at all. I can't today say is it 5% PTSD or 55% PTSD. What I will say is that PTSD, one of the core symptoms is hyperreactivity. So when a police officer pulls up behind you and turns on the light, even if you don't have a flashback, even if you are not, thinking directly of your time in Iraq, your normal adrenaline response will kick in and will likely have some impact. I don't think he was irrational. He knew that he had stuff in the car. He knew that he was facing jail time. He also had bad events in jail and prison. With the hyperreactivity, I think he got very caught up in the moment. Now, I'm not saying it was fight or flight and he lost rational thought. Also, the drugs, the sleep deprivation further impaired his ability to think. I don't think I can parse out and say what percentage it is, but I do think the whole picture has to be looked at.
So just to summarize, PTSD can cause hyperarousal, hypervigilance.
Yes.
Meth causes a person to be hyper, panicky.
Meth is a stimulant, and he had used cocaine prior, which is a stimulant. And again, I'm sure people have had a Red Bull or an energy drink or too much coffee and felt jittery and on edge. So could that have been part of what was going on? Absolutely. He chose stimulants to kind of help keep the hyper-arousal and the hyper-awareness involved and also to avoid sleep. So again, I think the PTSD heavily influenced drug use. Now, also, people can use drugs and not have PTSD. Some people like drugs. We don't engage in behaviors that we don't think is somewhat helpful or enjoyable. The question comes down to is how much did the PTSD contribute? From looking at his history, I do think the PTSD predates the drugs. I do think the drugs was in part caused by the PTSD, and I do think that it further impaired him.
Let me go back and ask something a bit further back in time. When Mr. McDowell got out of the triple canopy, he engaged in airsoft competitions with his friends,
Yes,
simulation of military activity.
yes,
He also took a job with Signal 88, where he was armed security at some of the worst apartment complexes in Jacksonville. If PTSD existed, why would he return to things that mimicked the experiences that gave him PTSD in the first place?
Yeah, and that was one of my big questions when I went to see him, because it seems counterintuitive to the avoidance aspects of what you normally see with PTSD. So that was a yellow flag for me. His description of why he did it made sense to me in the sense that he said, I felt hyper-aroused, and I felt that if I wasn't in a high-stress area, that I would look abnormal. So the symptoms he was having, he thought were protective or at least fit with that type of work. So the reason he was doing it is because he felt less abnormal in the short term. So what sometimes is a good short-term coping mechanism can further worsen his long-term behavior and functioning. So in the short term, I think he felt that he understood the rules of the game and was more normal, but as things went on, it just kept getting worse and worse. And towards the end of the airsoft, he said, I didn't even want to do that anymore. If it wasn't me and encouraging me to get out, if it wasn't some sense of disrupt the team, if I didn't go, I would have stopped. Even when he found activities that initially helped, over time, they became more problematic.
I want to ask you, I think, one more question, and that is, the jury has heard testimony that in 2017, a Marine named Ryan Baker, who had been under Mr. McDowell's command as a radio operator and was in the jump platoon, committed suicide. And it was upsetting not only to Mr. McDowell, but others in the jump platoon. Can an incident like that, a suicide of a fellow Marine, cause a spike in PTSD, or how does it impact the original PTSD when something like that happens?
Yeah, and when I talked with Mr. McDowell, that was one of the things he talked about, is that several of his people that were either directly under him or friends or people he had positive experiences with had committed suicide after the time in Iraq. And again, sometimes a death in and of itself can lead to negative emotions, but his response and reaction could be consistent with PTSD and the notion of survivor's guilt. So some of them he felt more directly responsible for because he was the one that said, hey, this is a good guy, why don't we put him on the jump platoon, per my understanding. And then that one particularly got to him because apparently that individual was well-liked, very religious, very strong, and seemed to be a good moral character and fiber. And his comment was, if even he would commit suicide, what chance did I have of making it out, especially after everything else that had happened in his life? So I think it really demoralized him. I think it really discouraged him. And he said, this was the guy who I thought was going to make it, and even he didn't. I'm now using drugs. I'm now having trouble. My marriage is divorced. How am I going to pull through this? Now, I'm paraphrasing a little bit. I don't want to over-romanticize it, but I think that's part of the significance of that particular death.
And I lied, I have one more question, and that is once you have PTSD, as you go through life and you experience further trauma or further stress, can incidents like that, do they spike the PTSD? Do they make it get either better or worse or change it in some way?
Yeah, and I want to be careful. PTSD is not necessarily a monolithic block. Many people can have different flavors or variation, for lack of a word. Some people may be more avoidant. Some people may be more hyper and aggressive or irritable. So you can see different patterns to it, and there may be ebbs and flows to it. So it doesn't mean just because you've been diagnosed with PTSD that you will be fully that all the time. But certain things can definitely trigger it, certain things can definitely spike it. use of drugs often makes things worse in the long run, even though in the short term somebody feels they're doing better. I think he had a lot of denial and rationalization with the methamphetamine use. You know, his comment to me was, well, cocaine was really bad because when I'd stop that, I'd get very depressed. And I had OD'd and suicided on the fentanyl and the opiates, but I thought I was functioning better with meth. Again, he wasn't thinking clearly, and I don't think he understood the full damage he was doing, and what he thought was protective, I think, was further harming him, and further exacerbated a lot of the underlying issues that he was dealing with.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. That's all I have, Your Honor.
Cross.
Good morning, Dr. Hall.
Morning, sir.
Dr. Hall, just to touch on a few things before we get into your report and some of the additional statements that were made during your course of the evaluation. You said that you made additional requests for information, and I'm not looking for what those requests were, but you said, I need some more material or I need something else, and you requested it and received it.
I believe so, yes.
So you understand that even if you receive certain names or documents, that as an evaluator, you can request additional things if they're going to help you.
Yes, and also I don't always know everything that's out there, so there may have been something I would have liked but didn't know about. So for example, I don't always know who's been deposed. I don't always know when the deposition was taken or when it's available. I believe a lot of people have come in and testified. I did not call and speak to all of them. So again, I may not have been aware of everything out there, but I thought I had enough information, and if I had questions, I could request more. And I think I got some additional video footage, was one of the things I asked for after the interview.
And I think you said as well that you reviewed deposition transcripts, but you also did collateral interviews, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that's because you don't just want to rely on the defendant's statements or any reports that you're provided, correct?
Correct. You often want to try and have as full of a picture as possible. That's why I like records. Contemporaneous impressions at the time are very helpful. So again, when he goes in 2010, he's not having legal trouble. So when he talks about those symptoms, the thought that they're being clouded by his legal issues aren't there as much. Whereas when I talk to him here and now, obviously the fact that he's involved in legal issues raises the possibility of how much is that clouding, impacting, or influencing what he's saying.
And you said among the interviews that you conducted, one of them was Aaron Middleton, who's a fellow Marine.
I believe so. Now, I apologize. I'm not always the best with names, but I believe he was one of his supervisors and was a lieutenant, if I'm thinking of the right person.
Yes, sir. And obviously, you have a lot of work to do and limited time to do it. Were these interviews about 15 to 20 minutes long?
Usually, and again, these were phone interviews where people were kind of calling me back, often taking time out of their day or at the end of the day, so I was trying to be respectful for them. And although this is a very important case, it's not the only case I do, so there were other factors that also sometimes came into play.
Yes, sir. And I'm going to get into some of the things that the defendant told you, because a great portion of the work that you do is gathering information from the defendant, correct?
It's definitely part of it. You need to see somebody to evaluate them and get a sense. Are there times where you may do a postmortem or try and come up with opinion if you haven't had access? Yes. But in general, you do try to see and evaluate the person because you may need to get clarification, information, and records. Sometimes a treatment provider may put something down in shorthand but not fully understand it. For example, one of the VA records said that he had a friend injured by a hand grenade. When I talked to him, he seemed to be more concerned about a rocket-propelled grenade. So I don't know if, there may be times where something in the record is in general accurate, but some of the specifics may be off. So you do try and interview, you do try and clarify.
Well, specifically, I'm going to turn your attention to page 49 of your report, if you want to follow along with me, so we are quite literally on the same page. And if you can let me know when you're there.
Yes.
So at the top of page 49, the defendant told you that he had friends or people in his platoon who were lost to weapons. And he's discussing RKG-3s and anti-armored vehicle weapons. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you reported that obviously he told you that that happened, but you don't know whether that's true or not.
No, and that's why I said when I went back and looked at the DD-214, and there's specific reference of him aiding in the evacuation of a gunshot wound. And as I said, I've read another report since then that raised the question of whether it was enemy fire versus an accidental discharge. I don't think that would matter for the PTSD necessarily, but that there was at least something to justify that he had been involved and had seen people that were injured while out on active patrol.
But in answer to my question, he said that he had people lost to the weapons that you were describing, the RKG-3s and anti-armored vehicle weapons.
Yes, and again, when I saw him, I'm writing down a lot of notes. So he said when he joined the unit, they had lost 7 people prior to that, and I think he said that he had people he knew who were injured while he was over there. Now, also at times, I may have not fully understood, or he may have mixed up events such as when he was in Triple Canopy, because he talked about people being injured while he was there as well.
Okay, and just to clarify, I mean, you may have mixed it up, as you said, but the way that it's reported here is that that was directly related to the Marines, correct?
Yeah, he said that when he was in the Marines, that he, again, somebody was shot, and I could verify that one directly. Some of the reports I couldn't directly verify, so I can't tell you how many times there was indirect fire and, you know, how close it was to his vehicle. He talked about somebody got injured and lost a limb. I can't independently verify that.
And to clarify regarding the individual that you said you saw some conflicting reports, whether it was enemy gunfire or accidental discharge, but someone was shot in the foot, correct? According to what the defendant told.
Yeah, and again, 4.5-hour interview, when you leave, you always wish, hey, did I clarify or ask something different? So that's one of those things where I'll admit, I took it as somebody was shot by incoming fire. I later read a report where it said that it was an accidental discharge. I don't think I directly asked, so I don't think he lied to me. And again, it may be one of those times where I made an assumption. So I will put that out there.
But to clarify, that person was not killed according to what the defendant said.
No, I believe they were evac'd out and that he was part of the evac to get them out.
In fact, I think you testified to this on the direct, but you said that he told you that he being the defendant, actually saved the person's boot and gave it back to him once they were stateside.
I'm not sure the person who, and again, this is one of those where we're talking 10 years later. I'm not sure if that's the same episode or a different episode, because he said the foot was blown off and he saved the boot of a blown off foot versus somebody getting shot. And I didn't clarify at the time whether it was shot in the leg or not. But he did say he saved a boot. Is it possible it's the same person? Sure.
Well, just to confirm, I mean, you wrote the sentence, he noted that one of his friends had their foot blown off, period. He did actually save the boot and gave it back to him later once they returned stateside.
Yes, he told me somebody had their foot blown off. I took that to mean stood on an improvised explosive device and lost the foot amputee style. Again, that could be an example where he said something that was factually accurate, and I may have assumed more than what was really there, possible. I'm not sure if the person that was evac'd out with the gunshot is the same person as the boot or if it's a separate person.
And he confirmed to you, and I believe, I'm sorry, but on direct you said that he told you he never had to shoot anyone when he was in the Marines, correct?
Yes, I asked if he had ever had to return fire, and he said no. He said when he was in Triple Canopy, he did.
Okay, and we'll get to that in 1 second.
Sure.
But he said he did see several friends get killed or injured.
Yes.
And that's, again, that is related. I know you said you could have misunderstood or misinterpreted, but that portion we were just talking about was related to his Marine service, correct?
Yes.
All right, let me turn your attention to page 51 of your report. Are you there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and this is, I believe, related more to Triple Canopy, if I'm correct.
I will take your word for it. I don't have every page memorized,
Well,
so.
let me- and
Page
that's-
50, it looks like I'm starting to talk about triple canopy, so I'll assume that's correct.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's the way I took it. I just wanted to make sure that you feel the same way and we're on the same page. So on page 50, you start talking about triple canopy. Page 51, he reported to you that while with triple canopy, he had to fire his weapon and he killed young adult males, correct?
Yeah, one of the things when I read the depositions was there's issues of did he fire on children or not? And again, the depositions were people who he was often using drugs with, and that's kind of why I say sometimes we assume the worst or somebody says something. So I was particularly asking, did you actually kill a child or not? And also I was kind of looking for a degree of exaggeration or malingering. And what he said is, and again, there may be specifics to this I don't understand. For our interview, we covered a lot of detail. We spent maybe 20 minutes on this. Is that they were out on a patrol, that their vehicle broke down or they somehow fell behind, that there was activity going on around him and that he was fearful that other people were going to overtake them, that they couldn't call for help the same way he would have as a Marine, and that there was times where, as a contractor, he fired his weapon. Most of them had head coverings or masks on, so he doesn't know if he was shooting at teenagers or 20-year-olds. He just said they looked younger. Now, I believe he was 27, 28 at that time, but I was specifically looking about, did you kill a child or not?
And you never, during your evaluation and your work on this case, you never spoke to any triple canopy members, correct?
No, I don't believe that they had been identified or I was aware of them at the time I was writing my report.
Okay, so he never told you, obviously, that triple canopy's responsibilities did not take them outside of the base for any patrol-type missions.
What he told me was that they were responsible for security, so that a lot of times he worked the gate at the base and that they were charged for security if there was diplomats or contractors or people that were meeting with government officials. So I believe that it wasn't a quote-unquote patrol like you would do with the Marines, but that they were out of the gate at that time because they were working as security for a diplomat, and that the palace or the government building or whatever had a riot, a mob, or something that disrupted it, was my general understanding.
And this, of course, is, again, just all reported to you. You're not there to say whether it's true or not. You're just hearing it from his mouth and documenting it and taking it into account when you come to your opinion in this case.
Yes, and again, I had records from Triple Canopy to review, so I did confirm that he was there and where he was at. Did they have every record, everything he did? No, and I don't know how good of records they kept.
But of course, nowhere in the records from Triple Canopy does it say that A, he left base to do any patrols, and B, he shot and killed anyone, correct?
No, the records I had looked more like standard employment records. When did he go in? Where did he do his training? When did he put in that he wanted to leave?
And you briefly touched upon this, but you point blank asked him, did he kill any women or children? And he said he did not.
No, he said that he shot at men that he couldn't give the exact age range, that they could have been adolescent to young adult.
And he stated that there was also an incident where there was a riot at a governor's house involving thousands of people, and he had to use his weapons to protect himself. He told you that?
Yeah, that their plan of leaving was blocked, and again, it may have been the same episode. And that's also one of those events where if it's 100 people, does somebody perceive it as more, or do they remember it as higher? So I believe he told me 1,000, but, again, do I think that was, I don't know the event itself. I don't know if it's exaggerated or not. But if it was 200 and he said 1,000, I don't think that would necessarily make me say he was malingering or overstating.
It's fair to say that not only do you not know if it was exaggerated, you don't know if anything like that ever even happened.
I can't independently confirm that. Some things I could. So when he's talking about certain provinces he's in, I could actually Google search that and did find a RAND study that talked about what was going on in Anbar province that was issued by the Marines or requested by the Marines. So there are certain things in a broad context I could identify. And again, that's where the DD-214 military records were so helpful, because they do say went out on 70 patrols, did go out on 20 patrols. So there was a lot more concrete number for those. Triple canopy, and this is part of the problem with private contractors, they're not the military, and in part that's why they're used sometimes. Their records, or the records that was available to me, were not as detailed or in-depth or as clear.
Turning your attention to the middle paragraph of that same page where he says his relationship, once he got back from Triple Canopy, he says his relationship with his wife further deteriorated and she went to California. Did he tell you that he made the decision to leave her and stay separated from her?
I think he could have gone to California, but he chose not to. I think when I talked with him, he said that we're not officially divorced, but we basically separated, and she took the child and went elsewhere.
Turning your attention to the next page, page 52, where you're beginning to, I don't think there's any doubt about this, you say relationship history, so I think we're
Yeah,
about his relationship.
I understand the
Yes, sir.
category. Thank you.
I guess the second paragraph down from relationship history, he says that he got involved with a woman named Haley, and the relationship lasted for 8 years from roughly 2011 to 2019. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think roughly in that range. And again, sometimes I tell people if you're ballparking, that's fine. If I think it's something I have to get more specific, so I took that as kind of a ballpark date when he's looking back, many years later. And if I may, one of the reasons it's sometimes important to look at relationships is that's one of the criteria D for PTSD is feeling numb, detached, and not able to connect with people. So again, there may be a lot of factors or a lot of events with him not going after his wife, but that could also be an indication of a PTSD symptom.
But he had, based on his account, a long-standing 8-year relationship with Haley Wheeler, correct?
Yes, and again, I did not interview Miss Wheeler, and I've not seen any of her depositions, but when I talked with the wife, she did not think much of Miss Wheeler and kind of described her as a very dysfunctional human being. So again, I think he was very dysfunctional, and he found it easier to be around a dysfunctional person. And I think he took on a little bit of a protectorate role, white knight, whatever terminology you want to use for it. And again, short term, I think it gave him some purpose or sense that he was doing good. Long term, though, I think Haley further destabilized him and was one of the major influences for the drug use.
On page 53, skipping ahead a couple of pages, where you describe his self-report of his living situation, he described that he learned the drug trade through treatment programs such as Matrix, correct?
Yeah, and I think he also learned aspects of the drug trade from his time as a security officer at Signal 88. He said he was in a bad apartment complex and he saw a lot of people that were doing it. I think he also learned aspects of it from Haley, but he also talked about that a lot of the people at treatment programs do it. Unfortunately, when I was up in Baltimore and we'd have methadone clinics, some of the hardest times was telling people how to get through the pushers and sellers at the front door who are trying to tempt them or trying to buy their take-home methadone to resell later. So it's not uncommon to see people target substance abuse areas.
Obviously, you're not based out of Jacksonville, but are you familiar with the Matrix program?
Not directly, no.
Okay.
What I will say is what he reported based off of my general training and experience, having been in different states, is consistent with patterns I've seen in other areas.
But it's fair to say that someone can either, in those programs, learn the drug trade or submit to the treatment and help that they're offered.
Sure. And again, treatment is good. There is the cycle of abuse with substances. Some people talk about you were never cured of your addiction. It's just when your next relapse will occur. And it often takes people multiple attempts at getting sober before they're successful. So I've seen people who have gone 6 months, a year, 2 years, and you think they're in the clear, and then they'll relapse. And I've seen other people who go 15 years, and they're still terrified that they could relapse the next day. So again, I tend to be a little more optimistic. I do think people can get clean and stay clean, but there are some people who try and put the fear of God that you're always one day away from a relapse.
And he said that he was selling drugs at the time, although not in the five-star facility. He was selling drugs at the time that he was engaging in five-star program treatment because he was surrounded by people who did not care for him.
Yeah, I think his last real stable employment, and again, I may have the timeline a little off, was about 2015, was Signal 88. Then I think he was doing a lot of independent work, whether that was tree work, whatever, but he was also selling drugs. And that was becoming his primary source of income. And again, I don't think he liked the people he was selling to, so it fed into his, kind of worldview of paranoia and everything else that I think got started with the PTSD in 2010, 2012-ish.
On that same page, related to his legal history, obviously he told you that he was arrested when he was 18 years old for breaking into a storage facility.
Yes.
Correct. And he blamed that arrest on running with the wrong crowd. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say that he blamed it. He said that's what happened, but I didn't get the sense that he was trying to deny responsibility or involvement. But he did say that he had a stepbrother that introduced him to the wrong crowd and that he started running more with the wrong crowd, and that's what led to that bad decision and him being there at that time.
Turning your attention to page 54, related to the substance use history. He said that Haley frequently smoked marijuana, but he did not care for it, correct?
Yes.
And previously, he had told you that he at least dabbled in or used some marijuana at a young age before he entered the Marines, correct?
Yes, and I think that was also in the Marine records too. Again, there may be areas where there is some degree of minimization. The Marine record said he tried once. When I talked to him, he said he tried more than once as an adolescent.
And then he said that he had periods with large amounts of alcohol intake, especially after leaving the Marines and prior to triple canopy, correct?
Yes, and I think that was also in the VA records that he had had a period where he was drinking more and then trying to cut back. Some of the later records, I think, suggest that he may have gone 5 years without using alcohol and then went to a concert in 2017 and started drinking again.
Okay, so it's a little bit unclear whether that statement was true as far as the amount of alcohol he was using.
What I can say is it was consistent with what I saw in the VA records, that he had periods where he was drinking more. Also, I do think that there were periods where he was doing better with sobriety between the Marines and triple canopy because they drug tested him before they'd let him in.
And his significant drug usage did not start until after 2015, when he stopped working as a security guard, correct?
That was kind of his report to me, is that's when things really started to get bad. Now, he told me when he was working as a security, he knew he could be drug tested. He was beginning to have some pain complaints, and there are records from the VA that he tried to get chiropractic adjustments for the back and the spine. They said it wasn't related to his service, but more due to his security work, so they didn't approve it. And he said he did start taking some medicine off the street, pain pills, things like that. But because he knew he was being drug tested, that it wasn't a daily thing or a frequent thing, but it was beginning to see the slip and the start of it.
So give or take, that was about 4 years after he returned from Iraq from his triple canopy service.
I don't have the timeline clear in my head. I would say probably within about 2 to 4 years seems reasonable. Again, I remember seeing, I think, the chiropractic request in 2012, so I don't know the exact date that he may have first used something that wasn't directly prescribed.
It's fair to say that after he returned from even triple canopy service, that he maintained a relationship with Haley Wheeler and maintained steady employment up until right after 2015. Is that correct, based on his self-report?
Yeah, and also the VA record showed him trying to go back and get treatment in 2012, which was after triple canopy, and that he was having a lot more problems, difficulties, that the marriage was coming to an end. So there are some, again, third-party records to refer to at that time.
in the last paragraph at the bottom there, he said that he felt cocaine was more problematic for him than methamphetamine, correct?
Yeah, what he said is I'd do coke and then I'd feel good, but as soon as I'd stop, I'd get very depressed. So he thought that cocaine was much more of a negative factor for him, and that he thought that he was doing better with meth and that he wasn't quote-unquote addicted to methamphetamine. Again, it's an interesting statement. Take with it what you will. Both of them broadly fall under a stimulant category of medication. They do have some minor differences. I think that methamphetamine probably has more of a dopamine effect than cocaine does. But again, I don't mean to get too much in the weeds there. But he seemed to think that he was functioning better on meth, although I don't think that's true. And again, I'd put that under denial, rationalization, something along those lines.
And he said that he did not like IV drugs.
I believe that's correct, and whatever my report says, I'll go with. I don't have an independent memory. I know he did have some narcotics. I know there were a couple of overdoses. I don't remember how he ingested it.
All right, I'm going to turn to page 63, and we'll discuss this, and then we'll get to the incident. We're getting there.
Yes, sir.
Are you there?
Page 63, yes, sir.
Yes, sir, thank you. And this kind of builds on the discussion we were just having about his drug usage, and at the bottom paragraph there, he outlines some treatment programs and his timeline of when he took various drugs. Is that correct?
I believe so.
And specifically,
Just to put in context, I did give him something called a forensic questionnaire. So when I interviewed him, some of his statements were oral to me, some of them were in writing. This was the questionnaire he filled out before I went to interview him.
yes, sir. Specifically, he said that he used marijuana sporadically from age 13 to age 18, and then from 32 to 35. Is that correct?
Yes, that looks like what's in there. When I interviewed him verbally, he said that marijuana was more of an issue in his adolescence, that he'd been exposed to it by a stepbrother, I think his father's third wife, something to that effect. And I don't think he said he never used to me as an adult, but he said it wasn't something he liked, cocaine and opiates were what he used a lot after Signal 88, and that he got into the methamphetamine after the court clinic. The
And then
Veterans Court.
He used fentanyl from age 32 to 33. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's what he's got written down here.
And then he used cocaine for 8 years on and off from 25 to 33. Is that correct?
Yes. And I think these timeframes were a little more detailed than what he said to me in the evaluation.
And did he tell you that he began using methamphetamine in 2020, the day that the COVID lockdowns occurred?
You know, I don't remember or have an independent recollection of the first time he used it. I do know that he did start using again after COVID.
All right, let me turn to page 61, and we will talk about the incident itself.
Yes, sir.
So Mr. McDowell told you that he was intoxicated, but he did not feel out of control.
I don't remember if he actually used the word intoxicated. He told me he had used methamphetamine that night and that he had done a hot rail an hour, 2 hours prior to the event.
But you put intoxicated in your report, correct?
If I did, that's what the report says. He said he had used.
Okay, so he didn't even say he was intoxicated. He just said that he had used and that he did not feel out of control, correct?
I would have to go back and look at my handwritten notes. I take quick handwritten notes and then I try and dictate. So again, I don't remember if he used the word intoxicated or not. I know that can have very specific legal effects. What I will say is he did say that he had used that day, that he had used by a method that would allow for rapid and large amounts of ingestion of methamphetamine, and that he was still driving, so he wasn't intoxicated in the sense that he was psychotic or didn't feel he could operate a vehicle.
But for sure, you know that he said that he did not feel out of control.
I don't think he was out of control.
Okay. And at some
For,
point,
for example, he was able to park, he was able to go into the gas station, he was able to use the restroom, he was able to wait for his passenger to come back out. So again, I think he had used, and he probably has a certain degree of tolerance. I think if I used that much, I would probably be psychotic, but he was not at that stage.
and he said that he felt trapped,
Yes.
correct? But he did not explain to you what he meant by feeling trapped.
I did not go into a great detail there. I asked him for his account of events. I didn't want to interrupt him too much, so I asked as an open-ended question. But the general sense I got, and again, I was asked to look at mitigation. This was not a guilty by reason of insanity. By the time I had seen him, he had already pled guilty or was planning to plead guilty. As he said, that I was there, that he pulled me over, that I knew that there were warrants and other things going on, and that I felt like I was in a bad situation, trapped. Yeah, in general, his implications was that there was a problem.
But there's no allegation from him or you, based on your opinion, that he felt in fear of physical violence or death or anything like that.
Not directly. He wasn't hallucinating. He wasn't in a flashback. He wasn't thinking that Officer Moyer was going to kill him on the spot. But he had had bad interactions in prison a year prior where 3 people had jumped him and had injured him. So again, he knew that if he was arrested, he would go back to jail, that he would go back for life. I think there was some concern that it would be a very negative impact on his life and that there was potential of physical threat, but not directly from Officer Moyer.
Yes, sir. Almost done. You said that during your testimony, you said that minor discrepancies are not a big concern for you, correct?
I said that minor discrepancies are not uncommon, and it depends on the nature and the degree. So again, I want to be careful and not give a blanket statement that says, hey, anything that's not fully matching up is always okay, but at times you can run into episodes where things don't match. So very basic, simple example of something I thought was a minor discrepancy is when I saw him, he said his son was already born. When I look at the VA records, they say his son is going to be born. You know, do I think that really impacts his level of functioning, his memory, or where things were at when I look at his history? No. But it was a minor discrepancy.
But it's fair to say, based on your classification of a minor discrepancy, a major discrepancy would potentially be an issue.
Could be.
And that is something that could certainly impact your opinion in this case or any case.
Sure. And again, you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. You got to look at what it is. Now, again, there have been times where what is considered a discrepancy may vary. So as a hypothetical example, I one time in court said that I thought something was 20%, and the lawyer thought that was a major discrepancy and pulled up a prior deposition. Here, you said 25%. I don't see that as a major difference, although factually, one time I said 25, another time I said 20. Discrepancy, or somebody may feel that's a minor discrepancy. So there is times where it's subjective. There's times you have to look at the context of it. Whether it's 1 in 4 or 1 in 5, I thought the general gist of it was similar. So hopefully that kind of puts it hypothetically where something may fall.
But your job is not to go track down every single fact and determine how true that statement is, correct?
No, I'm a psychiatrist. I have had additional training. I do always consider malingering. I do look at patterns, but I'm not a detective. I'm not an investigator. I don't have subpoena power.
So you just have to rely on the truth of the individual.
I have to rely on the person I interview, whether their presentation seems consistent with my training and experience, and whether it's consistent with the records I have available for review.
Thank you, Doctor. No further questions.
Redirect.
Dr. Hall, the report that the prosecutor referred to is 89 pages long. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And the prosecutor referred to maybe a dozen different pages to ask you questions about statements that were made. You referred to page 49, that Mr. McDowell told you that he lost friends, or he saw friends killed over there and injured. This jury has heard about a Captain Seipel whose arm was almost severed by by a mortar that was lobbed into the Marine camp. Would that be something that he told you about?
I don't remember that particular story of somebody losing an arm to a shell. I mean, he did talk about later at Triple Canopy there being a mortar attack where he got cut off from a Skype call with his wife. I think we spent more time on that. But I did think he said that he had been exposed. I may not have run down every episode.
Right. This jury has heard about a Marine named Curtis Hanking who accidentally discharged his weapon when it was on a 3-blast setting rather than 1 blast. Would that be an example? And Mr. McDowell was responsible for the evacuation of that fellow. Would that be an injury that he was able to see?
Yes. Again, I did not get into specifics. I don't know
Again,
whether it was 1 bullet or 3.
I just
but
want to run through these real quickly now.
Yes,
Do
sir.
you remember the name Curtis Hanking?
I don't, sir.
And this jury has heard testimony about a Brandon Lara who was injured by an IED and actually killed by an IED. Mr. Lara was a member of the police transition team. Is that a name that you remember?
No, sir. Again, he said that he had known people that were injured or hurt. I did not run down every one, and I'm not always the best with names. The name that stands out to me was Sanchez when he was at Triple Canopy.
Okay, and was that name actually Vasquez rather than Sanchez?
It may have been. As I said, I'm not always good with names.
And that was one of the 2 men who came in at the entry control point, one of them with a head blown off, the other with a leg blown off.
Yes, and he said that he socialized with them a lot when they had downtime on the base because he felt comfortable around the Army more than the other Triple Canopy people.
And if Mr. McDowell had wanted to deceive you or lie to you, he could have told you about these names and these incidents.
Yes.
Were you aware that the Triple Canopy base, Forward Operating Base Delta, was right next to the large city of Al Qut?
I believe he mentioned it. Again, not always good with names, and my Iraqi geography is not perfect. I know he spent time in the north and he was with the Marines, and he was more in the south when he was with Triple Canopy.
And is that the place where the government building existed where there was civil unrest?
I believe so.
Does sporadically smoking marijuana and drinking as a teenager indicate that Mr. McDowell was going to become an addict?
No. And again, I don't endorse drug use or underage drinking. I think it's bad. I don't think people should do it. With that said, a lot of people do. If you look at some of the Healthy Minds data, about 1 out of 4 people going into college have used marijuana at some time prior to entering college. Some of them have used it within 12 months prior to going to college. So I don't want to come across as flippant or trivialized, but sometimes people are young and dumb and do dumb things. However, when he was a Marine, he was literally noted to be quote unquote rock solid in some of his evaluations, that he showed maturity beyond his years. So, I mean, he was looking like somebody that the military had a positive impact on and was turning around up until when he left. And his early experiences were really good. It was at the very end where he had been in Iraq. And I wonder if he had done Iraq more towards the beginning of his service and had more time to adjust, if he would have done better. But it was Iraq and then relatively quickly out.
You admitted to the prosecutor that there were things that Mr. McDowell told you that you were unable to verify. A couple of things that happened with Triple Canopy. Is it surprising to you that Triple Canopy did not keep records that would detail every day of Mr. McDowell's existence while he was there?
At least not that I would see. And again, I want to be careful what I say. I've done disability evaluations, not criminal, but disability, for people who were other types of governmental contractors, tow truck drivers that were over there, firemen, things of that nature. So the records I got from Triple Canopy were consistent with the records I've got when I've done disability evaluations for people working for other contract firms,
Basically, employment records.
employment records.
And he made a lot of statements to you, and is it true that the bulk of the statements he made to you, you were able to corroborate by collateral sources such as records and interviews and depositions of his family and people who knew him?
Yes.
Page 61 of your report, the prosecutor pointed out that he told you that at the time of the shooting, he did not necessarily feel out of control. Is a person, and you said that that meant to you that he wasn't claiming that he was legally insane.
Correct. He wasn't saying he was psychotic. He wasn't saying he was in a flashback. He wasn't saying that he thought Officer Moyer was something he wasn't. Past cases I've done, I've seen people claim that they thought police officers were Taliban or something, and, you know, I'm not sure those were really true PTSD symptoms. He wasn't saying that to me. So what he said is I felt that I was threatened in the sense of I've got stuff in the car, I go back to jail or prison, I don't want to go back to jail or prison. He was very caught up in the moment, and again, that in and of itself is consistent with PTSD, but it's also consistent with drug use, but it's also consistent with normal human experiences. I've had a taillight that was out and a police officer lit me up one time. Did my heart rate go up in that initial instance the lights went on? Sure. If I had PTSD, could that have also affected my response? Potentially. So again, I'm not saying that the PTSD explains everything that occurred that day. I think the PTSD was part of it. I definitely think the drugs were part of it. I'm not excusing the drug use, but I think a large part of the drug use is related to his PTSD. So as a mitigating factor, did his service to the country, did his service at Triple Canopy influence or impact his state at that day? Yes.
Let me go back very briefly to that statement. So he told you that he didn't necessarily feel out of control, which meant to you that he felt he was not legally insane. In fact, he told you he shot the officer.
Yes.
He told you he was guilty,
Yes.
and he told you he either had pled guilty or was going to.
I don't remember where I heard that information, if that was directly from him or from another source, but he told me that he regretted the action, that he wasn't fighting it. And again, I apologize. I talked to him a year ago, and I don't remember every word he said. I don't have a photographic memory, but he expressed remorse and said I did wrong.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. That's all I have, Your Honor.
All right, the witness may step down.
Thank you, Your
And you
Honor.
are excused. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's about 12:15, so it's time to give you your lunch break, and we'll start back again at 1:45, so we'll give you an hour and a half to. That's fine. That's fine. All right, if you bear with me. as the attorneys are making their way back, ladies and gentlemen, we actually, I knew today was going to be a shorter day, but it really is going to be a shorter day. We're actually done for the day. And the reason being is there's one other witness. And I talked with the attorneys about this yesterday, and after you all left, there's one other witness that the defense wants to call who just cannot be available till tomorrow morning. And so that would be, I believe, the last witness you will call, is that correct? There will be one other short witness. Right. But that's it. And we're basically at the end, and there's just nothing they could do about it. And that happens when you're, particularly, I mean, this has been almost a 2-week trial. And so I think both sides have done an excellent job in letting me know where they were and what was needed, and I could transmit that information to you so you could plan accordingly. But on this one, it just, we got through some things a little bit earlier, and so we're going to be done for today. Tomorrow we'll come back. Again, as you heard, Mr. Chipperfield, the defense will be calling 2 witnesses. The main witness, the longest witness, will be an expert. The state will then have an opportunity to provide rebuttal testimony or evidence if they choose. And then after that, we have to move into what's called a charge conference, where we discuss what the instructions are going to be, what the verdict form is going to be that you're going to use. And so we'll be excusing you tomorrow, probably early as well. When I say early, it may be 1:30, 2, something like that. But it'll probably be a little early day as well, because once we get the instructions done, all that's left is to hear closing arguments and then for me to instruct you on the law. And we're not going to start closing arguments at 2 or 3 in the afternoon. We're not going to do that. We can't for a number of reasons. So today, you're going to get the last half of today back to do what you want to do, or to relax as you see fit. And I'm sorry I didn't give you a heads up on that. That's just, sometimes we just don't predict as well as we'd like. And, hopefully you all will have things that you can do, or just maybe it's a good afternoon to just not do anything as well. So that's up to you. Leave your notes here as you've done every day. I'll give you my instruction that I'm going to give you, which is please do not talk about the case with anyone, including among yourselves. Please avoid any media accounts from whatever source about this case, and please do not do any investigation or research into any of the issues or people, places involved in this case. So again, thank you for being here and ready to go. Your time is valuable. Sorry we didn't give you a little bit of heads up, a little better idea that we were going to be finishing. But we'll start tomorrow, same time, okay? And the other thing you should know is today when you go, we're going to stay here and work on some legal issues. It'll give us some time to do some things, and that way we won't have to take as much time when we deal with the charge conference on tomorrow, all right? Thank you again. You all are excused. Deputy, if you'll take them back, we'll see you tomorrow morning.